Hidden inside the long history of the Pokemon games, there are decisions so small and so quiet that most players will never know they were made at all. Some choices vanished before the games reached anyone's hands. Others left faint echoes in the finished product, traces of a path that was considered and then gently set aside. The kind of details that only surface years later in translated interviews and leaked prototypes, in the careful notes of historians who devoted themselves to understanding how these beloved games came to be. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this, and thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. There was a time, very early in the creation of the original Pokemon games, when the concept of types did not exist. The Pokemon being designed in those early months were simply creatures, drawn by hand, sketched in notebooks, imagined as things that could inhabit a small electronic world. They had shapes and names and rough ideas attached to them, but they did not yet carry the elemental identities that would come to define them. Fire types and water types and grass types were not yet part of the vocabulary. The game was being built without that particular language. This detail comes from a July 2000 edition of Nintendo Online Magazine, an interview courteously translated years later by Pokemon historian Dr. Lava. In that interview, Ken Sugimori, one of the founding creators of the franchise, explained that types were introduced partway through development, arriving mid-creation as a new layer of meaning added to an already growing project. The Pokemon that had already been drawn had to be reconsidered through this new lens, some of them adjusted or redesigned to visually reflect the element they had been assigned. Charmander received its flame, Venusaur received its plant. These were not always part of the plan. They were additions made after the type system arrived, details grafted onto existing creatures so that the logic of the world would feel consistent and whole. What that means is that some of the most iconic visual features of the most famous Pokemon in history were not original to them, not present in the earliest sketches, not part of the designer's first instinct. They were responses to a decision made somewhere in the middle of everything, a course correction that changed the look of the world forever. The flame on the tail of Charmander is now so deeply associated with that creature that it is difficult to imagine the Pokemon without it. It is the detail that players notice first, the feature that defines Charmander's personality, that warm orange glow in the darkness of a cave or a quiet night. And yet, that flame was added after the fact, a small edit made during a conversation about types, about what the games needed to feel complete and coherent. It is a reminder that the things which feel most essential are sometimes the things that arrived last. Another thing that arrived later than most players would ever guess is Pikachu. The most recognizable Pokemon in the world, the face of a franchise that has reached billions of people across generations of games, anime, cards, and films, was not part of the original roster. Pikachu was not present in the earliest stages of development. It was not one of the first creatures imagined, not one of the anchor designs that the game was built around. It came into existence partway through, created specifically because the type system had arrived, and someone needed to design a Pokemon for the electric type. That is what Pikachu was, originally. A creature built to represent electricity, a response to a mechanical need, a design created to fill a slot rather than to become an icon. The interview where this was confirmed, also from that Nintendo Online Magazine edition, translated by Dr. Lava, states simply that Pikachu was created to represent its type about halfway through development. There was no grand vision of mascot status. There was no plan for a yellow mouse to stand at the center of everything. There was just a type that needed a creature. The distance between that modest origin and the cultural weight Pikachu now carries is something almost impossible to measure. A single decision Made somewhere in the middle of a game's creation, a designer tasked with inventing a small electric creature resulted in one of the most beloved characters of the 20th and 21st centuries. It was born out of circumstance, shaped by constraints, and elevated by a chain of events that no one fully controlled or anticipated. The anime chose it, the merchandise embraced it, the world held on, and it all started with someone needing to fill a type slot. There is also something worth knowing about the Kanto starters, those three reptilian creatures that players have chosen between for decades. Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle are all based on reptiles or creatures that carry reptilian qualities, a fact that feels unusual compared to later generations, where starters tend to represent a wider variety of animal classes. The reason for this shared quality is explained in the same interviews. The earliest Pokémon designed for the original games leaned heavily toward dinosaur and monster-like aesthetics, large and slightly imposing creatures rooted in the visual language of giant animals from prehistoric imagination. The cuter designs came later. They were added after the more monstrous ones had already been sketched, layered into the roster to provide balance, to give the world a softness it had not yet found. By the time the starter Pokemon were being finalized, the three chosen creatures were all shaped by that earlier dinosaur instinct, all carrying the weight of the game's first visual vocabulary. Starters today span mammals, insects, birds, and creatures of many kinds. But the Kanto 3 exist as fossils of a specific moment, a snapshot of the game before the cuter sensibility had fully arrived. Sugimori also mentioned in those same interviews that the concept of choosing a starter at the beginning of the adventure was not part of the original design either. The idea of walking into a world and being offered three Pokemon to begin your journey, one fire, one water, one grass, came about mid-development as well. Before that decision was made, something else must have been planned, though the exact shape of that earlier beginning has not been precisely described. Perhaps everyone started with the same Pokemon. Perhaps players could simply begin catching creatures without a partner to accompany them from the first steps. Sugimori noted that the beginning of the game was changed approximately 10 times during development. 10 different openings considered and set aside before the one that players now know arrived and stayed. That moment of choosing, standing in a small room and picking between three creatures, is one of the most emotionally significant moments in the lives of millions of people. It was one of 10 possibilities. The weight of it, the ritual of it, could have been entirely different. The save file system in Pokémon is something many players have spent time thinking about, often wishing for a second slot, a place to begin again without erasing what already exists. Multiple save files have been a long-standing request from fans who want to revisit the early hours of an adventure without sacrificing a finished journey. What most players do not know is that multiple save files were not only discussed during the development of the original games, but were specifically planned. There were going to be 3 save slots in Pokemon Red and Green. 3, not 1. 3 separate files, 3 separate adventures that a player could maintain simultaneously on a single cartridge. Ken Sugimori described the decision to remove this feature in the same July 2000 interview, explaining that it came down to a choice between 2 things the development team could offer players within the limits of the Game Boy cartridge's available memory. The options were 3 save files or the ability to nickname all 151 Pokemon. The team discussed it, and the answer felt clear. Everyone agreed. Let the players name their Pokemon. The reasoning carries its own quiet logic. Nicknaming creates attachment. It transforms a creature from a creature into a companion, gives it an identity specific to the player who chose it, makes the bond feel personal and irreplaceable. 3 save files would have allowed more flexibility. Nicknaming allowed more feeling. The decision was made in favor of feeling, and it has stayed that way through every generation that followed. It is one of the most human decisions in the history of the games. Not a technical choice, not a business calculation, but a judgment call about what kind of experience mattered more. And the people who made it decided that the experience of caring about your Pokemon, of giving it a name and watching it grow, was worth more than the convenience of starting over without sacrifice. The absence of multiple save files has frustrated players for decades. It remains one of the most requested features in the franchise. But every request for that feature is, in a sense, an echo of a decision made before the first game was released, a decision made in favor of something that felt more important. Every player who has ever named a Pokemon after someone they love, or given a creature a silly name that made them smile every time it appeared in battle, has been the beneficiary of that original choice, even if they never knew it was made. Moving forward in time, there is a quiet secret embedded in the title screen of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl that almost no one who played those games would have noticed. The melody that plays when the startup screen appears, and the soft jingle that sounds when you press start on the title screen, are not original compositions created specifically for those moments. They are musical fragments pulled from something that no longer exists in the final game, something that was cut before anyone outside the development team could ever experience it. The Hall of Origin was an event designed for Diamond and Pearl, a mysterious location tied to Arceus, the Pokemon considered to be the origin of all things in the Sinnoh mythology. There was an item called the Azure Flute, as an object that, when used at the spear pillar, would open the way to a hidden ascending staircase, leading the player upward into a space where Arceus waited. The event was built, coded, given music, and then quietly removed before the games shipped. The Azure Flute was never distributed through official means. The Hall of Origin remained locked, but the music did not disappear entirely. The startup screen theme that plays when Diamond and Pearl begin, the gentle sequence of tones that accompanies those first moments of loading, comes directly from the Hall of Origin's audio. The press start jingle on the title screen matches the sound of the Azure Flute being used. These are musical echoes of something that was meant to exist, sounds from an event that never quite crossed the threshold into the world, preserved in the game's opening, like a faint and unintended memorial. The intent, clearly, was to foreshadow, to place the presence of Arceus at the very threshold of the experience, before the player had even entered their name or chosen their save file. The greatest and most ancient being in the mythology of Sinnoh was supposed to announce itself in the very first sounds the game produced. That plan survived even after the event was cut, because the music stayed and no one changed it, and so the game has quietly contained this echo for years, audible to anyone who knew where to look. It is the kind of detail that, once you know it, changes how those opening moments feel. The quiet melody of the Diamond and Pearl title screen becomes a slightly more complicated thing. It carries the shape of an intention that was not fulfilled, a piece of atmosphere designed to suggest something grand, and then preserved long after the grand thing was removed. There is a word for the feeling of encountering a space that was built for a purpose and then abandoned. The Hall of Origin, in all its digital emptiness, occupies a version of that feeling. The Hall of Origin event represents one of the most complete pieces of content ever removed from a Pokemon game before release. Most cut content consists of designs, ideas, partial implementations. The Hall of Origin was further along than that. It had been given music, integrated into the game's structure, connected to an item and a location. The Azure Flute existed as a real object in the game's code. The staircase leading upward from the spear pillar was accessible through cheating or data manipulation. Players who found their way there through unofficial means in the years after release found a barren version of a space that had been designed with care. The Arceus that waited there could be encountered, the battle could be fought, but the path meant to lead there, the azure flute and its jingle, and the official means of arrival, was never opened. The event was left complete but dormant, a finished room behind a locked door, built for visitors who were never invited, and the music from that room played every time anyone turned on their copy of Diamond or Pearl, in those first moments before the game properly began, because the music had been placed there as a promise of something that the game could no longer keep. There is something else worth knowing about the original games, something that sounds almost impossible when described aloud, but is confirmed in the same developer interviews that have illuminated so many other quiet facts. For a period during development, the health bar in battle did not exist. The system that every player knows, that red and yellow and green strip that tracks how close a Pokemon is to fainting, was removed at some point during the process of building the game, and something else was put in its place. Junichi Masuda, who composed the music for the original games and also contributed to their sound design, described this alternative in an interview. Instead of numbers and bars, the game used phrases. When a Pokemon was struck in battle, text appeared on the screen describing the severity of the damage. That hurt, the text might say. Or, that really hurt. The player received language rather than data, impressions rather than measurements, and approximations of pain rather than a precise accounting of remaining vitality. The experiment was abandoned. Masuda described the conclusion plainly, saying that battles became less interesting without the bar, that something essential to the feeling of engagement was lost when players could not track the specific state of their Pokemon with precision. The bar returned, and it has been part of the games ever since. But for some stretch of development, an early version of Pokemon existed where battles were narrated rather than quantified, where the experience of being hurt was described in words rather than displayed in diminishing color. That version of the game is completely inaccessible now. It exists only in Masuda's memory and in the account he chose to share. But it suggests a very different game, one where the emotional register of battle was communicated through language, where the system asked players to feel rather than calculate. It is a path that was tried and set aside, leaving no trace in the finished product except the memory of someone who was there. There's another subtle detail from the original games that Masuda embedded as a small private act of craft, something almost no player would ever catch unless they were paying very close attention to sound. In each of the Generation 1 games, red, green, blue, and yellow, the sound effect that plays when you save your progress is slightly different, not dramatically different, not changed in a way that transforms the experience, but altered in small ways that a careful ear could distinguish. The 4 versions of that sound are close enough to seem identical to most players, but different enough that they are technically 4 distinct audio events. Masuda created these differences himself, composing all the sound effects for the original games in addition to the music. This small variation was a kind of signature, a quiet act of attention to detail that had no practical purpose, but carried a kind of meaning anyway. It was a way of making each version of the game fractionally unique, a way of acknowledging that blue was not simply red, that yellow was not simply blue, that each cartridge contained its own slightly different relationship with the player who carried it. Most people never noticed. Most people will never notice. But the difference is there, coded into the games and preserved through every port and remake and re-release that has followed, a tiny piece of intentionality that has survived decades because it was built with care and then never disturbed. Masuda's role in the original games is worth sitting with for a moment, because it was unusually broad, even by the standards of small development teams working on large projects. He composed all of the music. He provided all of the sound effects. These were not separate departments, not teams of specialists working alongside each other. They were a single person doing an enormous amount of creative work in parallel with everything else happening around him. The save sound variation was possible because one person was responsible for all of it, because there was no committee to consult or standardize, because Masuda simply made a small choice and implemented it. That kind of singular creative ownership leaves traces that larger productions rarely contain. When one person controls a domain entirely, they can make choices that feel whimsical or personal without needing to explain or justify them. The save sound variation serves no function. It changes nothing about the experience for the vast majority of players. It is a small private pleasure, a signature of the person who made it, encoded in a moment that most people experience without thinking about it. It exists because Masuda was there, making everything, and wanted to make something slightly unexpected. The prototype of Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, the two games released in 2018 that reimagined the original Kanto journey with modern technology, was leaked online roughly 6 months before those games reached players. The prototype showed a game that was mostly complete, recognizable in its structure and visual design, shaped in nearly the same way the final product would be. But in certain places, things were still being decided. One of those places was the role of Red, the silent protagonist of the original games, who had become, over the years, a kind of legendary figure within the fiction of the franchise. In the final version of Let's Go, Red appears only in the post-game. He stands at a location and can only be challenged after the player has completed a series of demanding master trainer battles spread across the entire game. Red is distant, elevated, so a figure you approach only after proving yourself across dozens of difficult fights. His presence feels earned and slightly mythic, consistent with the way he has been treated across multiple games, as someone who exists just beyond the edges of the main story. The prototype tells a different story. In the build from 6 months before release, there is evidence that Red was meant to appear much earlier, outside the Pewter City Gym at the very beginning of the game, standing alongside Blue, the rival, in a moment where both legendary trainers from the original games would be visible at once. This would have brought Red into the main narrative from the start, would have made him a presence that accompanied the player through the journey, rather than a figure waiting at the end of it. The change that was made, the decision to push Red back into the post-game and make him a final, solitary challenge, shapes the emotional experience significantly. The Red, who stands waiting after you have already seen everything else, carries a different weight than the Red who meets you at the first gym. The final version chose distance and silence. The prototype suggested something warmer and more integrated. Neither choice is wrong. But the difference between them is the difference between a character and a legend, between someone who walks beside you and someone who waits at the edge of everything. There is a curious thread that connects two separate moments in Pokemon history, a connection that might be coincidence or might be something quieter and more intentional than that. When the Space World 1999 demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver was eventually leaked and examined by fans and researchers, one of the things they found inside it was Red's team, the same team he fields as the final boss of that generation, the mysterious trainer waiting at the summit of Mount Silver. His team was the same in the demo as in the finished game, the same Pokemon, the same lineup, but the levels were significantly lower. Underlevels, not nearly as powerful as the version of Red that players know from the finished Gold and Silver, where he stands at the top of the mountain with Pokemon that can wipe out an unprepared team very quickly. The demo Red was softer, lower in the numbers, easier by comparison. When players compared those demo levels to Red's team in Pokemon Sun and Moon, his appearance in those games as part of a paired battle alongside Blue, the levels matched almost perfectly. The Red, who appeared in the Sun and Moon era, visiting from whatever corner of history he inhabited, carried statistics almost identical to the Red from a prototype of a game released nearly 2 decades earlier. Whether this was a deliberate callback, a decision made by a developer who remembered the numbers, or whether it was a coincidence too precise to fully explain, the connection exists. It suggests a line drawn between a demo from 1999 and a finished game from 2016, a thread as of continuity stretched across an enormous span of time, visible only to those who knew both datasets and thought to compare them. That kind of quiet cross reference, hidden in statistics, unannounced and never explained, is the sort of detail that makes the history of these games feel like something worth exploring slowly, something worth returning to even after you think you have understood it. The secrets do not announce themselves. They sit in the numbers, waiting for someone patient enough to look. Every Pokemon game begins with a name, or rather, with the asking of a name. Before anything else happens, before the world opens or the journey starts, the game pauses and inquires who you are. It is one of the most intimate moments in any Pokemon game, this small question asked in a quiet menu, and it has been part of the experience from the very first entry. The naming of the player, and later the naming of the rival, is such a fundamental part of how the games begin that it is easy to assume it was always part of the plan. The rival system, the opposing trainer who appears throughout the journey, carrying Pokemon that grew alongside yours, challenging you at intervals in a pattern of competition that structures the whole experience, was something that developed over time. The precise shape of how the beginning of the game was structured, how the player was introduced, what choices were offered and when, went through approximately 10 revisions during the development of Red and Green by Sugimori's own account. The opening of the game as players know it, the quiet town, the errand, the laboratory, the choice, was one of many versions that were tried before it. Rival characters have since become one of the defining features of the franchise, evolving over generations from antagonistic to friendly to complicated, shifting in personality and moral weight depending on the generation and the story being told. But the original rival system, the one that set the template for everything that followed, arrived somewhere in the middle of the first game's development, not at the beginning, not as a foundational design element, but as an idea that found its place through iteration. The texture of these decisions accumulates into something that feels almost like a portrait of how creativity works at its most careful and patient. Nothing in the creation of these games arrived whole. Everything came through conversation and revision, through versions that were tested and found lacking, through choices made at specific moments by specific people who were trying to build something they could not fully see yet. The finished games carry the results of all of those decisions, but rarely announce them. The details sit quietly inside the experience, visible only if you know where to look or have access to the words of the people who made them. There is something almost tender about the moment Sugimori described, the moment when the development team sat around and considered the trade between 3 save files and the ability to nickname Pokémon. It is easy to imagine the room, the conversation, the weighing of two things that seemed comparable in complexity, but were very different in what they offered: memory versus connection, flexibility versus feeling, the practical versus the personal. The team chose the personal. That choice says something about who they were and what they believed the games should be. Pokemon is, at its heart, about relationships between a person and the creatures they carry. The nicknames are small. They change nothing about the mechanics. They carry no statistical advantage, but they make the experience more human. They turn a game about numbers and battles into something more like a story. And the people building the first Pokemon games understood that, even before the game had proven anything to anyone, even before they could know what it would become. The specific constraints of early hardware, shaped the Pokemon games in ways that players absorbed without realizing it, accepting the limits as simply the nature of the experience rather than recognizing them as the results of specific technical boundaries. The Game Boy cartridge had a finite amount of space. Every feature had to compete for that space. Every byte used for one thing could not be used for another. The save file question was not a philosophical debate in the abstract, but a practical conversation about what could physically fit and what could not. Those constraints are part of why the games feel the way they do, why certain things that seem simple or obvious from the outside were not included, why features that seem like they should have been there from the beginning arrived only later or never arrived at all. The developers were working with genuine limitations, making genuine trade offs, building something significant inside a small container. The decisions they made were shaped by those limits, and the games that emerged from those decisions were shaped by those limits too. There is something clarifying about understanding that. It transforms the absence of multiple save files from a failure or an oversight into a choice made within a real set of constraints. It transforms Pikachu's late arrival from an afterthought into the product of a system doing what systems do, generating needs and filling them. It transforms Charmander's flame from a signature into an addition, a visual detail grafted on after the type system arrived and demanded acknowledgement. These are not diminishments, they are clarifications. They make the games feel more real, more human, more like things that were made by people rather than assembled by processes. The prototype leaks that have emerged over the years, from Gold and Silver's Space World build to the Let's Go pre-release version, occupy a strange space in the history of the franchise. They are documents that were never meant to be documents. They are evidence of private decisions made in rooms that players were never supposed to enter. The people who created these builds had no expectation that anyone outside the development team would ever examine them, and yet here they are, available to anyone curious enough to look. What they reveal is a process, not a plan. Game development, especially on the scale that Pokémon operates, is not a matter of deciding what to build and then building it. It is a matter of deciding what to try, building it, evaluating it, deciding whether it works, and then trying something else. The Let's Go prototype with its earlier version of Red is a record of that process. The Space World demo with its underleveled teams is a record of that process. The games that players know and love are the endpoints of processes that these documents preserve. There is something almost archaeological about engaging with them, about examining a build from 6 months before a game's release and seeing the echoes of decisions that had not yet been made. The story is incomplete in those documents. The ending has not been written yet. Red is still standing outside Pewter City. The Hall of Origin is still meant to open. The save slots still number 3. And then, somewhere in the months that follow, decisions are made. Things are removed. Other things are added. The shape of the experience gradually resolves into the form that will be pressed onto cartridges and shipped to players. The process is not visible in the finished product. It is only visible in the before, in the prototypes and the interviews and the quiet accounts of people who were there. The starters of the Kanto region carry a shared aesthetic that extends beyond their reptilian inspirations into something more subtle, a sense of completeness as a set that was not always present. They were not designed to be a set. They were not conceived as a trio that would stand together in promotional artwork and trading cards and everything else that followed. They were individual designs, shaped by the monster aesthetic of the early development period, and they came together as a group only because the starter selection system arrived late enough that the available designs happened to share this quality. Bulbasaur is technically a dinosaur and a frog, and a creature that defies clean categorization, carrying a bulb on its back that would eventually be explained as a seed, a plant growing from the body of an animal. Charmander is a salamander with a flame on its tail, the flame added later, a visual confirmation of the type identity it had been assigned. Squirtle is a turtle with a rounded shell and a curled tail, a design that feels simple and fully realized, even though the game around it was still being assembled when it arrived. Together, they form something that has become so iconic that the individual paths that led to it are easy to forget. Each of them was designed in a period before types existed. Each of them was adjusted when types arrived. Each of them carries, in its current form, a mark of that adjustment, a design element that reflects the moment when the game's mechanical vocabulary was added to an already existing visual one. The flame is the clearest example, the most obvious evidence of that layering. But the whole process, the whole sequence of design and revision and addition is encoded in the shapes of these three creatures that every player encounters at the very beginning. The beginning is where every Pokemon game is felt most intensely. That first choice, that first step into the world, that first battle with a creature that belongs to you and no one else, is a moment that players carry with them for years after. The people who built the games knew this, or came to know it through the process of building them, and they made choices in service of that beginning that shaped everything that followed. The nicknaming system, the starter selection, the rival encounter, all of these elements were arrived at through iteration, through trying other things first and finding that the other things were not quite right. The game that was shipped was better for all of it, sharper and more human for all the things that were tried and set aside before it arrived. There is a gentleness to how these secrets feel when encountered slowly and with patience. They are not revelations that overturn anything. The games remain what they are. Charmander is still Charmander. Pikachu is still Pikachu. The save file still holds one journey at a time, but the knowledge of how these things came to be adds a layer of texture to the experience, a sense that the familiar was once unfamiliar, that the settled was once still in motion. Games are built by people who are trying to make something they cannot fully see. They iterate and revise and discard and keep, making thousands of small judgments that accumulate into the experience that reaches a player's hands. The player never sees the process. They see the result, polished and complete, and they engage with it as if it were the only possibility. But the developer knows, or the developers who came after them know through documents and interviews and prototypes that it was one of many possibilities, that every feature and every design and every mechanic arrived through a specific sequence of choices that could have gone differently. The Hall of Origin could have opened. Red could have stood outside Pewter City. 3 save files could have replaced the nicknaming system. Pikachu might not have existed at all, or might have existed in a form so different that the creature we know would be unrecognizable in comparison. The flame might never have been added to Charmander's tail. The type system might have been structured differently, or arrived earlier, or not arrived in the same form at all. Each of these possibilities was considered and set aside in favor of what exists. And what exists has been carried by millions of people across decades, has become part of the fabric of how those people experienced childhood and adventure, and the particular feeling of caring about something small and digital and yours. All of that was built from decisions and made in rooms that players never entered, by people who were trying their best to make something worth caring about. They succeeded, and the secrets that linger in the history of how they succeeded are, in their own way, as worth caring about as the games themselves. The quiet threads that connect development decisions to the final experience are not always obvious, even to the people who were there. Masuda may not have thought about the save sound variation as a legacy. Sugimori may not have imagined, when the type system arrived mid-development and required him to add a flame to a salamander's tail, that the flame would become one of the most recognized design elements in the history of interactive entertainment. The people making decisions in those rooms were not always making them with the knowledge of what they would eventually mean. They were just trying to solve problems, to make things work, to find the version of the experience that felt right. That is how creative work happens, not in flashes of complete vision, but in increments, in adjustments, in the slow accumulation of small right answers to small specific questions. The type system was added, and then Pokemon were redesigned to reflect it. The save file space was limited, and then a choice was made about what mattered more. A melody from a removed event stayed in the opening of the game. A team of Pokemon was leveled, and then leveled again years later in a different game to numbers that recalled the first time they were set. These are not grand gestures, they are small ones. But small gestures, made with care and intention, leave traces that last. The games carry those traces now. They will carry them as long as people play them, as long as anyone turns on a copy of Diamond and Pearl and hears that quiet melody before pressing start, as long as anyone names a Charmander with the name of someone they love, as long as anyone wonders what it would be like to start over without erasing what already exists. The secrets of Pokemon's development are finally not really secrets in the sense of being hidden or shameful. They are simply the truth of how something comes to be, the ordinary, extraordinary story of people trying to make a world and succeeding imperfectly and magnificently in ways they could not fully predict. That story is worth knowing. It makes the experience richer. It makes the world feel more real, more earned, more like something built with love and patience over time. And it is a story that once you know it, you will hear echoed in the sounds of the games, in the flame on Charmander's tail, in the jingle of the Diamond and Pearl title screen, in the small sound that accompanies saving your single, precious, unrepeatable file. These details do not demand urgency. They ask only for attention, for the willingness to sit quietly with something familiar and find in it a layer you had not noticed before. The games have always carried these layers. They have been patient, waiting in the code and the interviews and the prototype builds, available to anyone who came looking with enough calm and enough curiosity to find them. There is a kind of peace in that, in knowing that the things you love were built with this much care, this much attention to small decisions, this much willingness to try and revise and try again. The Pokemon games are what they are because of all the things they chose not to be. Every removed feature, every revised design, every choice made between two competing goods shaped the world that players have been returning to for decades. The world is richer for all the things that were tried and set aside, and it is worth carrying that knowledge gently into the quiet of the evening, worth letting it settle into the background of how you hold these games in your memory. The detail of the HP bar, the one that was replaced briefly by language and then restored, speaks to something fundamental about how Pokemon works as an experience. The game is built on information, on the player's ability to make decisions based on what they know. The HP bar is information. It tells you exactly where you stand, exactly how much space remains between your Pokemon and fainting. Remove that precision, and you are navigating by impression, by feeling, by the rough sense that things are going badly or well. There is something almost poetic about that alternate version of the game, the one where battle damage was described in words. That hurt. That really hurt. There is an emotional directness to those phrases that numbers do not have. Numbers are neutral. They do not carry the feeling of pain. But a phrase like that really hurt suggests something living, something that feels what is happening to it. The experiment lasted only a stretch of development, but the impulse behind it, to make the player feel the game rather than only read it, is an impulse that runs through Pokemon in many forms. Every design decision that favored nicknaming over save files, every choice that prioritized emotional connection over mechanical flexibility, carries the same impulse. The games were being built by people who cared about how the player would feel, not only what the player would do. The HP bar returned because feelings need to be anchored in information, but the instinct that removed it is still part of the DNA of the experience, still present in every aspect of the games that reaches towards something warmer than numbers. There is also something worth noting about the relationship between the Azure Flute and the Hall of Origin, and the way incomplete things are sometimes preserved without announcement. The music stayed. No one took it out when the event was removed. This could mean many things. It could mean that no one noticed, that in the process of removing the event, the music was overlooked. It could mean that someone noticed and decided to leave it, felt that the music was right for those moments, even if its original purpose was gone. It could mean that the removal itself was uncertain, that the event was pulled from the game late enough that changing the music would have required more work than simply leaving it. These are all possible explanations, and none of them is the kind of explanation that comes with documentation. The music just stayed, and now it plays in a context where most players have no idea what it was originally meant to do, and this is how things are preserved sometimes, not through intention, but through inertia, through the slow settling of a project that reached the end of its development time and shipped before everything could be perfectly resolved. The Hall of Origin event has since been restored in various forms in official and fan contexts. The Pokémon Legends Arceus game, released in 2022, gave players a different version of the encounter with Arceus, a different approach to meeting the being at the center of the Sinnoh mythology. The specific Hall of Origin event from Diamond and Pearl, the one that played the Azure Flute jingle, was never officially released through the games themselves. But the music played on. It played every time the game started, which for some players was a daily or near daily event across years of returning to that particular save file. There is something worth sitting with in the image of players hearing those first notes without knowing what they meant, without knowing they were being invited into a space that could never be reached the intended way. The invitation was always there. The door simply never opened. The Gold and Silver Space World demo, the one that contains the underleveled red team, also contains many other things that researchers and fans have spent years examining. Among the most striking are beta designs for Pokémon that were cut or significantly changed before the final games released. Some of these designs are dramatically different from the creatures that eventually appeared. Others are close enough to their final forms that the differences are subtle, barely visible unless you know exactly what you are looking for. The demo was presented at Nintendo Space World in 1999, a showcase where Nintendo displayed upcoming products and content to a public audience. The version of Gold and Silver shown there was nearly complete, but not final. It contained creatures that would be removed, designs that would be altered, and a structure that would be adjusted in the final months before release. The audience who attended Space World saw a game that almost was but never quite would be, and the document of that experience, the demo itself, eventually found its way into public hands years after the event, joining the archive of Pokémon history. Those who have examined the demo carefully have found among its contents the early versions of Pokémon that were later cut, including creatures that would never appear in any final game. They also found the Red Team, modest in its levels, existing in a form that would be revised upward dramatically for the final release, elevated to legendary status through statistics that made him one of the most challenging opponents in the original Gold and Silver. And then, years later, Sun and Moon looked back, and Red's levels in that game matched what had been in the demo. Whether anyone knew it at the time, whether it was a conscious choice, or an accidental alignment, the thread was there. The concept of creative iteration is invisible in finished products, but deeply visible in documents of the process. Every version of a game that existed before the final one is a record of a different set of decisions, a snapshot of a moment when things were still being weighed and adjusted. The prototypes and demos and leaked builds that have accumulated around the Pokémon franchise over the years form a kind of shadow archive, an alternate history of the games that runs parallel to the official one. In that shadow archive, the HP bar is made of words. Pikachu does not yet exist. The type system has not arrived. Red stands outside Pewter City. The azure flute plays, and a staircase rises from the spear pillar. 3 save files wait to be filled with 3 separate journeys. These possibilities are not better or worse than what exists. They are simply the shapes of roads not taken, the outlines of games that were considered and partially built before the final form settled into place. The games that players carry in their memories, the ones that defined childhoods and shaped habits and became the context for a particular kind of love, are the products of those roads not taken. Every revision made the experience sharper. Every removal clarified something that had been cluttered. Every addition filled a gap that had been felt but not yet named. The process was not clean. It never is, but it was careful, and the care is still present in the finished versions, still embedded in the flame on the tail, and the music in the opening, and the single save file waiting to hold everything you have built. These are the details that rest quietly in the history of something beloved. They do not need to be understood to be felt. The games work without this knowledge, but the knowledge changes something about the experience, makes it feel larger and more human, makes the familiar feel like the result of genuine effort, rather than simply the way things are. That is enough. That is more than enough, to know that what you carry with you was built with care, that the small decisions accumulated into something that has lasted, that somewhere in the long, patient history of these games, someone chose feeling over convenience, and the right answer was yes. The details rest now. The decisions have long since been made. The games are what they are, complete and familiar, shaped by processes that have finished and hands that have moved on to other things. What remains is the experience, the flame, the name you chose for your first Pokémon, the sound of saving, the memory of a title screen melody you heard 100 times without knowing what it was. There is another layer of the original games worth exploring slowly, one that concerns the very structure of how Pokémon was conceived before it became the thing the world knows. In the earliest stages of development, the game was called Capsule Monsters, a working title that pointed toward a different set of ideas about what the game would be. Capsules were central to the concept, small containers that held creatures, objects you could collect and trade. The image of a creature contained in something small, carried in a pocket, was already present, but the specific mechanics, the world, the relationships between trainer and creature, all of that was still forming. The transition from Capsule Monsters to Pocket Monsters to Pokémon represents a long journey of refinement that lasted 6 years from initial concept to the eventual release of Red and Green in Japan in 1996. 6 years is an unusual development period, even by modern standards, but for a game created in the mid-90s with a small team working on limited hardware, 6 years represents an enormous commitment to the development of something that did not yet have a proven market or a clear precedent. There was nothing quite like Pokémon before Pokémon arrived. The creator of the games, Satoshi Tajiri, was driven by a specific childhood memory, the experience of collecting insects as a child in a landscape that had since been developed into urban space. The natural areas where he had found beetles and caterpillars had given way to buildings and roads by the time he was an adult, and the game was, among other things, a way of preserving the feeling of that kind of exploration, of finding something small and living in the world and making it yours. The Game Boy's link cable, which allowed two players to connect their devices and trade or battle, became the nervous system of the concept. The creatures could travel between worlds. They could be shared. They could move from one player's experience and into another's. That trading mechanic, the one that required you to encounter other players and exchange creatures to complete the full collection, was not incidental to the game's design. It was fundamental. Tajiri wanted the game to be a living network of connections between players, a world that extended beyond the cartridge and the screen and into the social fabric of schoolyards and neighborhoods and friendships. The cables that linked Game Boys together were, in his vision, something like the underground networks of root systems that connect trees in a forest, invisible threads running between separate things and making them part of a single, larger whole. The final form of that vision, the thing that reached players' hands in 1996, had been adjusted and refined and simplified significantly from earlier iterations. But the core feeling, the sense that the game was about connection and discovery, and the small excitement of finding something unexpected in the world, that core had been protected through all the changes. It was the thing that could not be traded away for space or memory or efficiency. Everything else could be negotiated. The feeling could not. Another detail that most players carry without knowing its history is the design of the original 151 Pokémon themselves. Ken Sugimori has described the process in various interviews, and one of the things he has noted is that the designs were influenced by his own artistic development at the time. He was working in a particular style, influenced by the manga and illustration traditions he had grown up with, and the Pokémon he drew reflected that style in ways that are still visible in the original sprites. The soft curves, the approachable proportions, the tendency to give creatures expressive eyes that communicated personality immediately, all of these were part of Sugimori's natural approach to character design. The challenge of designing 151 distinct creatures while maintaining a visual coherence that made them feel like they belonged to the same world was significant. Each creature needed to be recognizable as a Pokémon, needed to fit within the aesthetic vocabulary of the game, but also needed to be distinct enough from the others that it would feel like its own individual entity. Too similar, and the roster would feel repetitive. Too different, and the world would feel incoherent. The balance required constant attention, constant comparison between designs, constant asking of whether what was being built still felt like itself. Sugimori has mentioned that one of the criteria he used to evaluate designs was whether he personally found them interesting, whether they made him want to draw them again or see them in motion. This sounds like a simple threshold, but it is actually quite a demanding one. The designs that passed it had to reach beyond technical competence into something more like genuine appeal, something that made a person want to engage with them, not just because they were well executed, but because they were alive in some quality that went beyond craft. Many designs were made and rejected. The 151 that survived were the ones that cleared that bar. The process of creating the original Pokédex entries is another quiet area of development history that reveals something about the intentions behind the games. Each Pokémon was given a small entry of text describing its habits, its biology, and its place in the world. These entries were written with a specific tone, a tone of naturalistic documentation, as if the creatures were real animals being cataloged by researchers in the field. The language was calm and slightly formal, the kind of language that appears in field guides and biological surveys. This tone was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice to treat the Pokémon world as if it were real, to write about the creatures as if someone had actually observed them over time and recorded their behaviors. The entries refer to the Pokémon's weight and height, their habits, their diets, their relationships to other creatures, and to their environments. Some entries contain surprising or unsettling details that were clearly meant to suggest a world more complex and more strange than it first appeared. The Pokédex was a document of a real place, written with the seriousness that real places deserve. That commitment to treating the world as real, even in a document as small as a Pokédex entry, contributed significantly to the feeling that the games produced in players who were young enough to find the boundary between the game world and the actual world still flexible enough to be crossed imaginatively. Children who read the Pokédex entries did not always register them as fiction. They registered them as information about something that might, in some sense, be real. That imaginative crossing was partly enabled by the tone of the writing, by the decision to document rather than to describe, to observe rather than to narrate. The original game's professor, Professor Oak, carries within him a specific set of historical decisions. He was named after a tree, a tradition that would carry forward through every generation of games that followed, each new professor named for a different variety of tree or plant: oak, elm, birch, rowan, juniper, sycamore, kukui, magnolia, each name marking a new generation, each carrying the same quiet, naturalistic quality that suited a character whose role was to understand the living world. The naming convention was not announced as a policy. It emerged from the design of the first character and was then honored by the teams that followed. Professor Oak's specific role in the original games, the one who gives the player their first Pokémon and sets them on the journey, was itself the subject of revision during development. The way the opening scene was structured, the errand that leads to the laboratory, the encounter with the three Pokémon, the choice, the beginning of the adventure, all of this went through the approximately 10 revisions that Sugimori mentioned. Oak, as the giver of the beginning, as the framing device for everything that follows, is a character whose importance was established through iteration rather than through original design. There is also the question of what the games were meant to teach, what experience they were designed to produce in someone who played them. Tajiri has spoken about wanting players to feel the sense of discovery he had felt collecting insects as a child. But there is another quality in the games that comes through most clearly in the trading mechanic, in the need to find another player and share creatures with them. The games were designed to make players talk to each other. They were designed to require other people. No single player could complete the Pokédex alone. The game was incomplete unless it opened outward into a social world. This design decision was unusual for a time when games were largely solo experiences. The Game Boy was a personal device, carried in pockets and played in quiet moments, and the idea of designing a game that could not be fully experienced without another person and another device and a cable connecting them was a significant departure from convention. It assumed that players would find each other, that they would want to share what they had found, that the circuit of trading and battling would be something they sought out rather than something they avoided. The assumption was correct. Pokémon became a social phenomenon, in part because it was designed to be social, because the game's internal logic created a reason to turn to the person beside you and say, "What do you have? And what do I have that you want?" The link cable was the physical object that made this possible, and the specific decision to make certain Pokémon version exclusive, to ensure that no single version of the game contained every creature, was the mechanic that made the social interaction necessary rather than optional. These design decisions feel like they belong to a different era of thinking about games, an era before the internet made the question of how players would find each other much easier to answer. The solutions arrived at in the mid-90s, the link cable, the version exclusivity, the trading mechanic, were elegant responses to a genuine constraint. They turned a limitation into a feature, made the need to find another player feel like an adventure rather than an inconvenience, made the exchange of creatures feel like a meaningful act rather than simply a data transfer. The battery saves in the original Pokemon games for the Game Boy are another small technical detail that carries its own quiet history. The cartridges used internal batteries to maintain save data when the device was turned off. This meant that every cartridge had a limited lifespan for its saves, a battery that would eventually exhaust itself and leave the data without power to sustain it. Players who held onto their original cartridges through the years discovered, sometimes decades later, that their saves had been lost, that the Pokemon they had raised and named and carried through hundreds of hours of play were gone. This is a kind of impermanence that digital games had not fully reckoned with in that era. The assumption was that saved data was permanent, that what you built in the game would remain available as long as the cartridge existed. The reality was that the cartridge had a clock inside it, a small ticking mechanism counting down toward the moment when the power would fail and the memory would clear. Many players discovered this only when it happened, when they turned on a childhood game expecting to find their old adventure and found instead a blank beginning, a world with no memory of having been lived in. The battery save limitation is one of the reasons that Pokemon games moved to different forms of data storage as technology changed. Flash memory, which does not require a separate battery to maintain data, became standard as cartridge technology evolved, but for the games of the original era, the Game Boy Color, the early Game Boy Advance, the saves were always provisional, always dependent on a small chemical reaction continuing to sustain them. There is something poignant about knowing this, about understanding that the adventures players built in those early games existed within a temporary structure, that the permanence they felt was borrowed from a battery that had a finite life. The Pokemon that were named and raised in those games, the Charizards and Blastoise and Pikachus that players carried through their childhoods, were sustained by something invisible and finite. And when that invisible thing ran out, they were gone. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, between one session and the next. The concept of loss is not usually foregrounded in discussions of game design, but it is embedded in the earliest Pokemon games through this technical fact. Every adventure stored in those cartridges was temporary in a way that most players did not know. The experience of loss, when it came, was often unexpected and genuinely painful. Players who had not thought of a game as something that could be lost found that it could be, that the familiar world was fragile in ways they had not recognized. This fragility is part of the texture of the original games now, part of what makes them feel like they belong to a specific era, a time before persistence was guaranteed, before cloud saves made the question of where your data lived a concern resolved by infrastructure rather than batteries. Those early cartridges contained something precious and provisional, and the players who kept them understood this only in retrospect. The music of the Pokemon games is worth dwelling on, not only for the save sound variation that Masuda encoded into the original entries, but for the way the compositions have shaped the emotional experience of the franchise across its history. Masuda composed the original soundtrack alone, working within the limitations of the Game Boy's sound hardware to create melodies that could convey the specific feelings associated with each part of the game. The cave music needed to feel claustrophobic and slightly tense. The town music needed to feel warm and inhabited. The battle music needed to feel urgent and exciting without becoming exhausting. Each of these was achieved through the specific vocabulary of the hardware, through the particular qualities of the sounds the Game Boy could produce. The bleeps and tones that make up the original music are now inseparable from the emotional memory that players carry of those games. The Pallet Town theme, the cry of a wild Pokemon appearing in tall grass, the rising notes of a victorious battle, all of these are acoustic keys to specific childhood feelings, sounds that unlock something in the memory of anyone who spent time with those games, young enough to absorb them without distance. Masuda's role in creating those sounds alone, in making all of the musical and sonic decisions without a team or a department, means that the entire acoustic identity of the original games is the product of one person's sensibility. The choices he made about what feelings to evoke, what tempos to set, what emotional registers to establish, were not negotiated or compromised or averaged out through collaboration. They were made by one person, doing the work at a specific time in a specific state of mind, and then embedded in the game permanently. This is how certain artistic decisions become canonical, not through committee or consensus, but through the specificity of a single creative act at a decisive moment. The music of the original Pokémon games is canonical not because it was approved by a standard, but because it was made by Masuda and it was right, and then the games shipped and it became the sound of Pokémon in the memory of a generation. The transition from the original games to the subsequent generations required careful decisions about what to preserve and what to change. Gold and Silver, the second generation, added the Johto region while keeping Kanto accessible, essentially doubling the size of the game's world in a way that no previous Pokemon entry had attempted. This decision came with its own set of design challenges, its own questions about what the Johto region should feel like in relation to the Kanto region that players already knew. The two regions needed to feel distinct from each other while still belonging to the same world. Johto needed its own identity, its own visual vocabulary, its own sense of place. It also needed to feel like a region that could connect to Kanto without the connection feeling arbitrary or unearned. The design team working on Gold and Silver made choices about Johto's aesthetic, about the balance between traditional and modern imagery, about the specific creatures that would inhabit its roots and cities that were influenced by the goal of making the two regions feel like genuine neighbors rather than simply adjacent areas in a game map. The Pokemon themselves in Gold and Silver were designed with the knowledge that they would exist alongside the original 151. They needed to feel like they could share a world with Pikachu and Charizard and Mewtwo without looking out of place. This was not a trivial constraint. The original designs had established a particular aesthetic, and the new designs needed to extend that aesthetic without simply copying it, needed to feel like genuine additions to an existing tradition rather than imitations of it. Some of the decisions made for Gold and Silver have since become part of the franchise's permanent identity. The day and night cycle, the breeding mechanic, the ability to call friends on a Pokegear and arrange rematches, all of these were introduced in that generation and either carried forward or became the basis for systems that evolved into later mechanics. The games were experimenting with what a Pokemon game could be, what systems it could contain, how complex its world could become while still remaining approachable. The Space World demo, with its underleveled red team and its beta designs for creatures that would never appear in the final games, is a record of a moment when those decisions were still being made, when the shape of Gold and Silver was still being negotiated. The creatures in the demo that were eventually cut represent possibilities that were considered and rejected, roads not taken into a Johto that would have been slightly different from the one players eventually explored. It is worth noting that the beta designs in the Gold and Silver demo included some creatures that look in retrospect remarkably finished, remarkably close to what a final Pokemon design should look like. They were not rough sketches. They were developed enough that they had distinct personalities and clear design concepts. They simply did not make the cut for reasons that may have included roster balance, type distribution, similarity to other designs, or simply the judgment that the design that replaced them was better. The creative decisions involved in assembling a Pokédex are not only about individual designs, but about how those designs function together, how they complement and contrast with each other, how they distribute across types and habitats and size categories, in ways that give the player a world that feels varied and complete. A single great design can be cut to make room for something that serves the larger ecosystem better. The beta Pokemon of Gold and Silver that never made it to the final game were casualties of that kind of thinking, good individual ideas that did not fit well enough into the final arrangement. The history of the franchise is, among other things, a history of curation, of deciding what to include and what to leave out, what to carry forward from previous generations, and what to leave behind, what innovations to embrace, and what established elements to preserve. Each generation of games is a fresh set of those decisions, made by a team that inherits the legacy of all the decisions that came before and has to work both with and against that legacy in building something new. The weight of that inheritance grows with each generation. By the time a new Pokemon game is being developed, there are hundreds of existing creatures to consider, dozens of established mechanics to evaluate, generations of player expectation to navigate. The decisions that were made simply in the first game, where the constraints were the blank page and the limited hardware and one person's creative instincts, become increasingly complicated as the franchise grows. Each new entry exists in dialogue with everything that preceded it, and yet the core feeling remains consistent. The experience of walking into tall grass, of encountering a creature and making the choice to fight or flee or throw a ball, of watching the animation of a catch and wondering whether it will succeed, of opening the menu and seeing the name you gave something that is now a level higher than it was the last time you checked. These feelings have remained stable across the decades because the decisions that produced them, decisions made in small rooms by tired people working within tight constraints, were good decisions, decisions that held. The specificity of those original decisions, the choice to prioritize nicknaming over save files, the choice to make the type system visual through creature design, the choice to make the world require other people, the choice to let the music carry the emotional weight of each moment. These choices produced something that turned out to be more durable than anyone could have known at the time. They produced a world that people wanted to return to, a world that became part of how people understood themselves and what they cared about. That kind of durability is rare in any creative work. It cannot be planned for entirely. It emerges from the quality of attention that was brought to the work at its inception, from the care that was taken with small decisions when small decisions were all that was being made. The people who built the original Pokemon games were not building for the ages. They were solving problems and making choices and trying to create something good enough to reach the people it was being built for. They were trying to make something worth the time it would take to play. That is the most ordinary ambition in game development, and it is the one that, when it succeeds completely, produces something that lasts. The evenings are quieter with this knowledge, the familiar things a little more legible for understanding something of how they came to be. The games sit in their cases, or their digital libraries, with all of their history contained in them, invisible and patient, waiting for the moment when someone thinks to ask. These are the questions worth asking in the quiet hours, when the world has settled and there is space for something gentle. How did this come to be? Who made this choice? What was the other possibility? The road not taken, the save file not kept, the flame not added to the tale. The answers are there, in interviews and demos, and the small archived fragments of a creative process that was never meant to be public. They are patient answers, willing to wait for someone who comes looking in the right spirit, with the right kind of attention. There is a particular kind of attention that the Pokemon games reward, a slowness that most players develop without being asked for it. The games do not rush. They allow the player to explore at their own pace, to backtrack, to spend time in areas that have already been cleared, to return to roots and look for creatures they might have missed the first time through. This quality of unhurried exploration is not incidental to the experience. It was built in deliberately, part of the design philosophy that treated the game as a space to inhabit rather than a problem to solve. The pacing of the original games is especially notable given the hardware they were created for. The Game Boy was a portable device, designed to be picked up and put down, to be played in short sessions during commutes or breaks, or the quiet moments of an afternoon. The games could have been designed to match that context, to be completable in small fragments, to reward speed and efficiency. Instead, they were designed to reward the opposite. They were designed to be slow and expansive, and full of things that could only be found by someone willing to take the time. This was another decision made by people who understood something about the kind of experience they wanted to create. Not an experience of consumption, of moving quickly through content toward a destination. An experience of presence, of inhabiting a world and finding its textures through patient attention. The Route 1 just outside Pallet Town does not ask to be crossed quickly. It asks to be walked through, to have its grass examined, to have its ledges studied, to have its trainers spoken to. The game has always been more rewarding for those who approach it with that spirit. The legendary Pokémon of the original games represent another layer of design history worth sitting with. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, the three legendary birds of the Kanto region, each tucked into a specific remote location, accessible only after significant progress through the main adventure. Mewtwo, hidden in a cave that could only be reached after defeating the Elite Four, waiting at the end of the longest walk in the game. These were creatures that the game revealed slowly through the process of becoming capable of reaching them, through the accumulation of progress and strength that eventually opened the path to their locations. The design of legendary Pokémon as creatures tied to specific places is one of the franchise's most durable decisions. It makes the legendary feel genuinely rare, genuinely significant, something encountered in a particular location at a particular moment in the journey, rather than appearing at random in tall grass. The encounter with Articuno in the Seafoam Islands, the cold maze of the dungeon, the encounter itself at the end of that maze, all of this was designed to make the moment feel earned. You had been through something to reach it. You had navigated and survived and persisted. Mewtwo carried even more of this quality. The backstory of the Pokémon, the Pokédex entry that described it as the product of genetic engineering, the journal entries found in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island that suggested its creation and escape. All of this narrative context was built into the world as found text, as things the player encountered and assembled into a story, without anyone telling them they were doing so. By the time you reach Mewtwo in Cerulean Cave, you had already read the story of its creation. The encounter felt like arriving at the end of something, rather than simply finding a powerful creature. This approach to storytelling, the approach of embedding narrative in objects and locations and journal entries, rather than in cutscenes and dialogue, was part of the original game's design philosophy. The world told its own story if you were willing to read it. The player who explored every building, read every sign, talked to every character, found a world with more depth than the main quest required. The depth was there for the players who wanted it, invisible to those who moved quickly through toward the credits. The rival of the original games, the character who takes the remaining starter and becomes the recurring antagonist of the journey, was designed with an intentional ambiguity about his motivations. He was arrogant and dismissive, quick to belittle the player's progress, and confident in his own superiority. But he was also genuinely skilled, genuinely dedicated, someone who had worked hard at the same goal the player was pursuing. His presence throughout the game created a competitive pressure that kept the player aware of how they were progressing, a persistent reminder that someone else was on the same path and moving through it quickly. The decision to give the rival this particular personality, This sharpness that bordered on cruelty without quite crossing into villainy was a design choice that influenced how every rival character in the franchise would subsequently be understood. Later games would offer friendlier rivals, more complex rivals, rivals with their own stories and vulnerabilities. But the original rival established the template, and the template was one of uncomfortable competition, of someone who pushed the player forward by making them want to prove something. His team at the end of the game, on the roof of Sylph Company, and in the final battle at the Pokémon League, reflected the same dedication to excellence that his personality suggested. He had not been careless. He had built a strong team, made good choices, arrived at the summit through genuine effort. Defeating him felt like defeating someone who deserved to be on the same mountain you were climbing, and that made the victory mean more than if he had simply been outclassed. The legacy of that rival design is still present in how the franchise constructs its opposing trainers, still felt in the gap between the rivals who feel genuinely threatening and the ones who feel like obstacles. The original rival was threatening not because he was evil or powerful in an abstract sense, but because he was working as hard as the player was and wanted the same thing. That specific kind of competition, the competition of two people both trying their genuine best, is harder to construct than simple antagonism and more satisfying to overcome. The Elite Four system, the final sequence of battles before the champion, was another design element that the original games established and that has persisted through every subsequent generation. Four trainers of increasing difficulty, each specializing in a specific type, encountered sequentially without rest between battles. The challenge of the Elite Four was not simply the strength of the individual trainers, but the cumulative effect of facing four of them in sequence, the attrition of health and resources that built across the fights, and made the eventual encounter with the champion more challenging for the journey to reach them. This design creates a specific kind of pressure, a sense that the resources you have are finite and the challenges ahead are fixed, that surviving requires management and prioritization rather than simply having strong Pokémon. Players who approach the Elite Four without preparing, without stocking healing items, without considering the type matchups of the upcoming opponents, found the challenge genuinely difficult. Players who prepared carefully found it still demanding but navigable. The design rewarded preparation without making it strictly required, which is one of the harder balancing acts in game design. The champion waiting at the end, the figure who held the title that the Elite Four protected, was the culmination of everything the game had built toward. In the original games, that champion was Blue, the rival, the same character who had been dismissing the player's progress throughout the journey, now revealed to have arrived first and claimed the championship before the player could reach it. This revelation was a design choice of considerable elegance. The rival was not simply an antagonist to be defeated. He was a fellow traveler who had gotten there first, who had to be bested on his own terms, at the summit, having accomplished the same thing the player was trying to accomplish. Defeating him there, in that position, carrying those stakes, was the most satisfying version of the final battle the game could have designed. It was not a battle against an abstract threat or a character introduced for the purpose of being a boss. It was the resolution of a competition that had been running since the very beginning of the game, since the moment in the laboratory when a choice was made and a rival took what remained. The entire structure of the game, from the beginning through the Elite Four to the champion battle, was designed to feel like a journey that concluded somewhere specific and personal, not against a world-ending threat, not against an organization bent on destruction, against the person who had been ahead of you the whole time, who wanted the same thing you wanted and had worked as hard to get it. That particular design decision, that choice of rival as final boss, shaped how an entire generation of players understood what a Pokémon game was for. It made the game feel like a story about personal excellence rather than heroism, about becoming the best at something you cared about rather than saving the world. Later games would add world saving stakes to the formula, would introduce legendary threats and shadowy organizations and narratives of cosmic significance. The original games asked only whether you were the very best, and they asked it in a way that felt like it mattered. That question, the one encoded in the game's tagline and its final structure, was a question that players who were young enough to take it seriously found genuinely worth answering. The process of answering it, of raising Pokemon and learning type matchups, and working through the gym badges, and navigating the Elite Four, and finally arriving at the championship, was a process that took weeks or months and produced something that felt like genuine accomplishment, not because the game told you it was an accomplishment, but because you had been there through all of it, and you had done the work, and you had arrived somewhere specific with something to show for it. The details of how that experience was built, the nicknaming decision, the type system, the rival design, the legendary locations, the Hall of Origin melody that played before any of it began, all of these are part of the foundation beneath something that millions of people felt without knowing the foundation was there. The feeling was real. The engineering of the feeling was invisible, as good engineering usually is, present only to those who go looking for it deliberately. You have been looking tonight. You have followed the quiet paths that lead from the finished experience back to the decisions that produced it, and you have found in those decisions something worth knowing. The people who made these games were careful with them. They were trying to make something that would matter to the people who played it, and they succeeded in ways that surprised even themselves. That success was built on small choices, on a conversation about save files and nicknames, on a type system added mid-development, on a melody that played at the opening of a game long after the event it was written for had been removed, on a rival who got there first and had to be beaten at the summit, on a professor named after a tree, and a tradition of naming that followed from that single choice. These are the foundations. They have held a long time. They will hold a while longer still. The relationship between the games and the anime that ran alongside them is another thread in the development history worth following, particularly in the early years when both were finding their shapes simultaneously. The anime chose Pikachu as the partner Pokémon for its protagonist, a choice that was made before either the anime or the games had proven their appeal to the wider world. That choice had consequences for both. It elevated Pikachu to a prominence that the games had not yet assigned to it. It made the small electric creature the face of something enormous before that something had become enormous. The anime's Ash, the protagonist who carried Pikachu through years of episodes across multiple regions, was designed to be a version of the player character from the games, a young trainer setting out on a journey to become a Pokemon master. But the anime Ash was given a personality and a history that the player character in the games deliberately lacked. The player character in the games was a blank space, a vessel for the player's identity, someone without a predetermined personality so that the player's own personality could fill the space. Ash was the opposite. He was specific, enthusiastic, sometimes naive, persistently optimistic, occasionally reckless. He made mistakes and learned from them in ways that the player character never needed to, because the player character's mistakes were the player's own and were corrected by the player rather than written into a story. The two characters served different functions and were designed accordingly, and the tension between them, the question of which version of the protagonist was the real one, has been part of how fans have engaged with the franchise for decades. The Pokemon anime introduced some elements to the broader franchise that have since been so thoroughly absorbed into the overall identity of the series that it can be difficult to remember they were not always there. Team Rocket, the villainous organization of the Kanto region, exists in the games as a criminal enterprise of some complexity. In the anime, Team Rocket became something different. Jesse, James, and their talking Meowth became recurring characters who appeared in almost every episode, became beloved for their ineptitude and their loyalty to each other, became, over years of episodes, something closer to protagonists in their own right than villains. The games contain Team Rocket as an obstacle and an ethical problem, a criminal organization to be dismantled. The anime contains Jesse and James as characters to be watched and occasionally sympathized with. These are not the same organization. They share a name and a symbol and a general orientation towards stealing Pokémon, but they do so in completely different emotional registers, and the characters who define them are completely different in their qualities and their functions. The dialogue between the games and the anime has produced elements that then migrated between them in unexpected ways. Certain Pokemon who received significant roles in the anime found their profiles elevated in subsequent games. Certain game elements that were adapted into anime episodes became part of how a wider audience understood the world of Pokemon. The franchise is, in this sense, not a single story but a conversation between multiple tellings, each influencing the others in ways that are often difficult to trace precisely. The trading card game is another strand of this conversation, another medium that developed its own vocabulary for the Pokemon world while maintaining connections to the games. The cards introduced a different kind of rarity, a different relationship to the creatures, one where the physical object mattered in ways that the digital game did not. A holographic Charizard card was not simply a representation of Charizard. It was a physical object of value, something that could be held and traded and displayed, something with a material presence that the game's sprites did not have. The experience of opening a booster pack was another kind of discovery, another version of encountering something unexpected and wanting it. The parallels to the games, to catching creatures in tall grass, to not knowing what would appear in the next moment of play, were deliberate. The design of the card game's economy of rarity mirrored the game's design of creature rarity, gave players another form of the same emotional experience with a different set of objects. The development history of the trading card game runs parallel to the development history of the video games, with its own set of decisions about rarity distributions, about which Pokemon to feature in which sets, about how to balance competitive play against collector appeal. These decisions were made by different teams working with different constraints, and the card game's history has its own set of cut concepts and revised designs and mechanics that were tested and then changed before cards reached players' hands. The holographic Charizard from the base set, the most famous single card in the game's early history, was not designed to be the most famous card. It was designed as one of several rare holographic cards, each featuring a powerful creature at the top of its evolutionary line. The fame that attached specifically to Charizard rather than to the Blastoise or Venusaur that occupied the same rarity tier came from factors outside the design of the card itself. Charizard was the creature that resonated most powerfully with the children who were collecting in those years, for reasons that connected to the anime and the games, and something harder to name, some quality of the dragon-like fire creature that touched the imagination more directly than a giant turtle or a plant dinosaur. The fame was not engineered. It emerged from the interaction between the design and the audience and the moment, from the particular combination of those factors that produced the outcome of one card, becoming iconic in a way that its equally rare companions did not. This is another example of the gap between what is designed and what is felt, between what the people making things intend and what the people receiving things experience. The Pokémon franchise is full of these gaps. They are part of what makes its history so interesting to trace, why the distance between what was planned and what happened is so often larger than anyone at the time of planning could have predicted. Pikachu was not supposed to be the face of everything. The flame on Charmander's tail was an addition made mid-development. The Hall of Origin was supposed to open. 3 save files were supposed to exist. None of these was the outcome, and yet the outcome has been carried and loved for decades. This is the nature of creative work at scale, the impossibility of predicting which decisions will produce which feelings in which people at which moments. The best that can be done is to make careful choices, to prioritize the things that seem most likely to matter, to remain open to revision when the evidence suggests that a different direction would be better. The people who made the original Pokémon games did all of these things, and the result has outlasted most things made in the same era. It will likely continue to outlast. The games are still being made, still carrying new generations of players through the same essential experience of choosing a partner and setting out into a world. The specific details change. The regions are new. The creatures are different. The mechanics evolve, but the core feeling, the one that Tajiri was trying to recreate from his childhood, the feeling of finding something small and living in the world and choosing to take care of it, that feeling has remained consistent. That consistency is the most remarkable thing in the development history, more remarkable than any single decision or revision or cut feature. The people who built the games identified something true about a kind of experience that people wanted to have, and then built a vessel for it that has remained intact through 30 years of changes and additions and the inevitable pressures of a franchise that has to grow to survive. The vessel is still holding. The feeling is still inside it, and the people who come to the games still find what they came for: the small pleasure of a world that moves at the pace of patient attention, the quiet satisfaction of a companion that grows alongside you, the particular completeness of having been somewhere and seen everything it had to offer. These are not complicated pleasures. They do not require sophistication or experience to access. They are available to anyone who approaches them with the willingness to engage, which is why they have been available to so many people across so many years. The games were built for this kind of accessibility, for the possibility of entering at any point and finding the world ready to receive you. The development secrets that have been explored tonight are the history beneath that accessible surface, the layer of decision and revision and intention that produce the thing that players walk into without knowing it's making. That layer is always there, in every game and every film and every book, the invisible work that preceded the visible experience. Most people never see it. The experience is designed precisely so that they do not need to. But seeing it, when the opportunity presents itself, when someone translates an interview or examines a prototype or documents the echo of a removed event in an opening melody, adds something to the experience rather than removing from it. The world is not less beautiful for being understood. The games are not less enjoyable for knowing that the nicknaming system came at the cost of multiple save files, or that the type system arrived midway through and required redesigns, or that a small yellow electric mouse was invented to fill a slot and became the face of everything. They are more beautiful, if anything, for the knowledge that they were built by people who were trying their best and making careful choices under real constraints. The care is present in the finished work. The work reflects the attention that was paid to it, and knowing something of what that attention required makes the finished work feel more earned, more worth the years of returning to it that so many players have given. You carry these stories now, along with everything else you carry from these games, the memories of first adventures and chosen partners and names given to creatures that felt, for the duration of the game, genuinely yours. They were genuinely yours. The games were designed to make them so, and the people who designed them understood what they were doing when they made that choice, even if they could not have known how much it would matter to how many people across how many years. The closing miles of any long journey have their own quality. a particular kind of attention that comes with knowing the end is near. The Pokemon games understand this. The final stretch of each entry, the approach to the Pokemon League, the long road through the Elite Four, the arrival at the champion, all of this is paced with the understanding that something is concluding. The music changes, the opponents grow stronger, the world narrows toward a single point of resolution. That pacing was designed. The feel of a journey concluding was something the development team at Game Freak worked to produce, arranging the final section of the game so that the player's awareness of ending would build gradually rather than arriving all at once. The Elite Four's sequential structure ensures that the player cannot rush, cannot simply find the champion without first moving through four difficult battles, cannot skip the accumulation of effort that makes the final encounter meaningful. This attention to pacing across the entire arc of the game, from the quiet beginning in Pallet Town through the long middle section of gyms and routes and rival encounters to the final climb, was a design achievement that required seeing the game as a whole experience rather than a collection of individual elements. The people who built it were thinking about the shape of the journey, not only its content, not only the creatures and the mechanics, but the feeling of moving through something that had a beginning and an end and a sense of direction. That feeling of direction, of moving towards something worth reaching, is one of the most durable qualities of the original games and of the franchise they founded. The games are not games without destination. They are journeys with specific conclusions, adventures with specific resolutions. The credits that roll after the champion is defeated are not simply an ending. They are an arrival, a moment of recognition that something has been completed. And yet the game continues after the credits. The world remains accessible. The creatures that were missed can still be found. The Pokédex can still be completed. The post-game opens new areas and new challenges. The journey, it turns out, did not end with the credits. It reached a milestone and then continued in a different register, quieter and more exploratory, without the pressure of the championship ahead. This structure, the game within the game that the post-game represents, was designed to give players something to do after the main story concluded, to ensure that the world did not feel empty once the primary goal was achieved. It also gave a home to some of the game's most interesting content, to the legendary Pokémon tucked into remote locations, to the challenges that required fully developed teams, to the things that were too difficult or too optional to place in the main path. Mewtwo in Cerulean Cave is the ultimate expression of this design, reachable only after the credits roll, hidden at the end of a maze-like dungeon, encountered without ceremony or preamble, simply present and waiting. It is one of the most effective pieces of game design in the franchise's history. No cutscene introduces it, no NPC explains its significance. The player arrives through the cave, turns a corner, and finds it. The encounter's power comes entirely from context, from everything the player has read and heard about Mewtwo in the process of playing through the game. The journal entries in the Pokemon Mansion, the Pokédex description, the whispers in the game world about a creature of terrible power, all of this has prepared the player for the encounter in a way that explicit narrative introduction could not have matched. The encounter earns its weight through what the game built before it, through the patient accumulations of context that made Mewtwo's presence at the end of the cave feel like an arrival at something long anticipated. That is the work that careful development produces. Not the individual moment, but the whole arc that leads to it. The dozens of small decisions that create the context in which the moment can land with the weight it deserves. The whole history of these games, from the earliest design decisions to the final polish before release, is the story of that kind of careful, patient work, of people who understood that the moments players would remember were not created in isolation, but were the product of everything that preceded them, everything that built the world in which those moments could occur. The secrets of that development are part of the foundation beneath everything. They are invisible in the playing, present only for those who go looking, but they are there, as real as the flame on Charmander's tail and the melody in the opening of Diamond and Pearl, as permanent as any small thing made with genuine care. Carry them gently into the rest of the evening. They belong alongside everything else you carry from these games, the quiet, patient, ordinary, extraordinary story of how something worth loving came to be. There is a moment in the development of every beloved game where the people making it begin to understand something they could not have known at the beginning. They begin to understand what the game actually is, as opposed to what they thought it was going to be. The original Pokemon games passed through that moment somewhere in their 6 year development, somewhere between the early sketches of creature concepts and the finished cartridges that reached players' hands in 1996. The game that shipped was not the game that had been imagined at the start, and the distance between the imagined version and the finished one is filled with exactly the kinds of decisions that make development history worth following. Game Freak in those years was a small studio, a team of developers working in conditions that most modern game studios would find difficult to recognize as a professional environment. Satoshi Tajiri has described the period as one of genuine financial difficulty, a stretch of years during which the studio was sustained largely by the dedication of people who believed in the project enough to continue working on it without the certainty that it would ever be completed or released. There were moments when the project seemed likely to be canceled, when the combination of technical challenges and the ambition of the concept came close to exceeding what the small team could deliver. The Nintendo Game Boy was a constrained platform, and making it do what Tajiri envisioned required solutions that were not always obvious and did not always exist yet when they were needed. The link cable communication that allowed two Game Boys to trade and battle Pokémon was technically complex in ways that the hardware had not been designed to support in quite that fashion. The team had to work through problems that were genuinely difficult, that required creative thinking about the constraints of the hardware and what was possible within those constraints. The 6 years of development were not 6 years of steady progress toward a known destination. They were 6 years of iteration, of building and testing and finding problems, and building again, of the kind of patient experimental work that does not feel heroic in the moment, but produces in retrospect the foundation of something lasting. Tajiri has spoken about the development period with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, acknowledging that there were stretches during which the work was genuinely grinding, genuinely difficult, genuinely uncertain in its outcome. The Game Boy itself is worth considering as a context for the development of the games. Released in 1989, the device was already several years old by the time Pokémon began its development in earnest. It was not new hardware. It was not the most powerful hardware available. The Super Nintendo was doing things that the Game Boy could not begin to approach in terms of visual complexity and processing capability. And yet the Game Boy was the device that Tajiri chose, specifically because of the link cable. No other device at the time allowed two players to connect in the way the Game Boy's link cable made possible, and the link cable was central to the concept from the very beginning. The choice to develops for older, less powerful hardware, because that hardware had a specific feature that no newer hardware offered, is a design decision that prioritizes concept over spectacle, that says the mechanic matters more than the presentation. That hierarchy of values, placing the experience of connection above the experience of visual sophistication, is one of the things that made Pokémon feel different from other games of its era. It was a game built around what it was designed to make you feel and do, not around what it was designed to look like. This orientation toward feeling over spectacle has remained a quality of the franchise, even as the hardware has become more capable and the visual presentation has grown more sophisticated. The games look significantly better now than they did in 1996. But the core experience, the relationship between player and creature, the movement through a world discovering what it contains, the exchange of creatures with other players, has remained structurally similar to what was present on the Game Boy. The spectacle has grown, the foundation has not changed. The Game Boy's limitations also forced design decisions that turned out to be strengths. The small screen meant that Pokemon sprites had to be readable at very small sizes, which encouraged designs with strong silhouettes and distinctive features rather than intricate details that would be lost at small scale. The limited color palette of the original Game Boy, which displayed only 4 shades of gray rather than actual colors, meant that designs had to communicate through shape rather than hue, that a creature's identity had to be legible in its outline before it was legible in its coloring. When the Game Boy Color arrived, and Pokemon Yellow and subsequent entries could be displayed in actual colors, the designs that had already been established through the constraint of grayscale remained strong because they had been built on the harder foundation of shape rather than the easier foundation of color. A design that works in grayscale because its silhouette is strong works even better in color. A design that works only in color because its distinctive quality is its hue struggles in grayscale. The original Pokemon were built for the harder condition and thrived in both. The gym system, the structure of 8 gym leaders, each representing a specific type and culminating in a badge that marks progress through the region, was another design element that arrived through the development process rather than existing fully formed from the beginning. The gym leaders are, in retrospect, one of the most immediately recognizable elements of the Pokemon formula, so central to the experience that it is easy to assume they were always there. But the specific structure of 8 gyms, 8 badges, 8 type specialists standing between the player and the Pokemon League was worked out through the same process of iteration that shaped everything else in the games. The gym leaders of the Kanto region were designed with specific personalities that their in-game presentation only partially conveys. Brock, the rock-type leader, was imagined as someone whose strength came from patience and endurance rather than aggression. Misty, the water-type leader, was designed as someone whose outward toughness concealed a more emotional interior. The later leaders, Koga of the poison-type gym, Sabrina of the psychic-type gym, each carried design concepts that went beyond simple type specialization into something approaching characterization. Sugimori has spoken about wanting the gym leaders to feel like real people with real styles and personalities, not simply obstacles that happened to specialize in a given type. The limited dialogue and the simple in-battle interaction did not allow for much characterization, but the visual design of each leader and the aesthetic of their gym were meant to communicate something about who they were beyond their battle strategy. Brock's gym was filled with boulders. Misty's gym had its pool. Lieutenant Surge's gym had its electric puzzle. Each space was designed to reflect the person who occupied it, to give the gym itself a personality that the leader's brief dialogue could not fully provide. This attention to the design of the spaces within the game, not just the creatures and the mechanics, but the visual and experiential qualities of the places the player moved through, was part of what made the original games feel like a world rather than a game board. The spaces had aesthetics, they had moods. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town felt different from the Silph building in Saffron City, which felt different from the Game Corner in Celadon City. Each space communicated something about where you were and what kind of experience the game was providing in that moment. The Lavender Town sequence is worth dwelling on specifically because it represents one of the original game's most interesting departures from the generally upbeat tone of the adventure. Lavender Town is where dead Pokemon are laid to rest. The Pokemon Tower is a graveyard. The music that plays there, the Lavender Town theme, has become one of the most discussed pieces of music in the franchise's history, in part because of its genuinely unsettling quality, its minor key, and its unusual rhythm that creates a sense of unease without arriving at anything explicitly frightening. The decision to include this space in the game, to give the world of Pokemon a place specifically dedicated to grief and loss and the deaths of creatures that trainers had cared for, was a significant creative choice. It acknowledged something that the rest of the game's structure tended to avoid: the fact that the creatures in the game could die, that the journey had stakes that extended beyond winning and losing battles. The Pokemon Tower gave those stakes a space in the world, a physical location where their reality was acknowledged. The Lavender Town music was revised between the Japanese release of Red and Green and the international release of Red and Blue, a fact that became the subject of considerable fan speculation in the years after the games reached a global audience. The original Japanese version of the Lavender Town music had characteristics that some players reported finding genuinely disturbing, an unusual quality that distinguished it from the rest of the game's soundtrack. The revised international version was different enough that the difference was noticeable to those who had experienced both versions. Whether the revision was made because of reports of the music's effect on players, or whether it was simply part of the broader localization process that adjusted many elements of the games for international release, has never been definitively established. The designers did not provide detailed commentary on the specific reasoning behind the change. What exists is the fact of the change, the original version and the revised version, and the gap between them that players have filled with speculation and theory in the decades since. The Lavender Town music is one of the most frequently discussed elements of the original games in fan communities, precisely because it occupies a space where the documented facts end and the interpretive space begins. The facts are few and concrete. The music was changed. The original had qualities the revision lacked. Beyond that, the available information does not resolve the question of why. And the unanswered question has generated more discussion than a clear answer would have, because unanswered questions invite imagination in ways that settled facts do not. This is another quality of the Pokemon games that has contributed to their longevity: the presence of spaces where the game does not explain itself, where the player is left to construct their own understanding from incomplete evidence. The story of Mewtwo assembled from journal entries and Pokedex descriptions rather than cutscenes, the Lavender Town music and its unexplained revision, the Hall of Origin event that built to a moment the game never officially delivered. These are spaces of productive mystery, places where the game opens onto something larger than itself and invites the player to imagine what might be there. The Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo waits, has no in-game explanation of why a creature of such power would be there, or what it has been doing in the darkness of the cave since its escape from the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. The player arrives and finds it, and battles it, and that is the entirety of the game's engagement with the question. The rest is supplied by the player's own imagination, by the context built through the rest of the game, by the specific feeling of arriving somewhere dark and finding something unexpected waiting. That creative gap between what the game shows and what the player understands is one of the most powerful tools in interactive storytelling, and the original Pokemon games used it with considerable skill. Not because the designers were explicitly theorizing about gaps and imaginative engagement, but because they were building a world with more depth than any single playthrough could fully explore, and the places where that depth exceeded the playthrough's reach became the spaces where the player's imagination filled in what the design could not. The move system in the original Pokemon games, the structure of 4 moves per Pokemon, each with limited uses measured in the PP counter, was another design element that arrived through the development process and has persisted through every subsequent generation. The decision to limit each Pokemon to 4 moves created a design space of meaningful choice that has defined the strategic depth of the games for decades. every Pokemon could potentially learn many moves, but could carry only 4 at any given time. The selection of which 4 to carry was one of the most consequential decisions a player made in building their team. This constraint, the 4 move limit, transformed what might have been a simple numbers game into something that required genuine strategic thinking. Not just which Pokemon to use, but which version of which Pokemon, which combination of moves, which coverage the selected moves provided against which types of opponents. A Pokemon carrying the wrong 4 moves could be significantly less effective than a version of the same Pokemon carrying a more thoughtful selection. The constraint created depth by forcing players to make irreversible choices with long-term consequences. The PP system, which gave each move a limited number of uses before it had to be restored through items or rest, added another layer of resource management to the strategic picture. A move with high power but low PP had to be used carefully, preserved for the moments when it was most needed. A move with low power but high PP could be used more freely, could serve as a reliable fallback when the stronger options had been depleted. The balance of power and PP in move selection was a genuine strategic consideration that rewarded players who thought about it and punished players who did not. These systems were not created through deep game theoretic analysis of what would produce the most strategically interesting results. They were created through a combination of intuition and iteration, of trying different structures and evaluating whether they produced the experiences the designers wanted the game to have. The 4-move limit might have been tried after a version with a different limit was found to be less satisfying. The PP system might have been introduced because battles without resource constraints felt too uncomplicated, too easily decided by raw numbers, without strategic nuance. The specific numbers that define the system, the 4-move limit, the specific PP values assigned to different move categories, the way those values were calibrated to make different moves feel different in their strategic role, all of these are the product of design decisions that were tested and adjusted until they felt right. They feel right now. They have felt right for 30 years. The system has been refined in subsequent generations, with moves added and mechanics adjusted, but the fundamental architecture of 4 moves per Pokémon, with PP managing their use, has remained constant because it was correctly designed in the first place. Another design element worth exploring is the experience point system, the mechanism by which Pokémon grow more powerful through battle and eventually evolve into new forms. The experience curve, the rate at which experience points accumulate, and the amount required to reach each new level was calibrated to make progression feel rewarding without feeling too rapid or too slow. A Pokémon that leveled up too quickly would reach its final evolution before the player had formed much attachment to the earlier forms. A Pokémon that leveled up too slowly would test the player's patience in ways that worked against the sense of forward momentum the game needed to maintain. The evolution mechanic itself, the transformation of one creature into another through the accumulation of experience, and sometimes through other specific conditions, was one of the original game's most powerful emotional tools. The moment of evolution, the animation of a creature changing into its next form, was designed to feel significant, to mark a transition that the player had worked toward and finally achieved. The music that played during evolution, the simple ascending progression that accompanied the transformation animation, became one of the most immediately recognizable sequences in the games, a signal that something important was happening. That sequence of notes, the evolution jingle, was composed by Masuda, along with everything else in the original games, and it has persisted through subsequent entries in various forms, updated and revised, but always carrying the same emotional intention, the same communication that a change of consequence is taking place. Players who have been through the evolution sequence hundreds of times across decades of playing the games still respond to those notes with something that functions like recognition and anticipation, a Pavlovian connection between a sound and a feeling that was established in childhood and has never fully dissolved. The specific conditions under which different Pokemon evolve were designed to create variety in the experience of evolution and to give players different kinds of milestones to work toward. Most Pokemon evolved through leveling, through the accumulation of experience, through the patient investment of time in battle, but some required specific items, evolutionary stones that could be used to trigger an immediate transformation. Others required trading with another player, reflecting the game's design philosophy of encouraging social interaction. Others had special conditions, requiring specific times of day or specific friendship levels or other circumstances that rewarded attentive players. This variety in evolution conditions created a design space where different players could have meaningfully different experiences with the same roster of Pokemon, where discovering an unexpected evolution condition felt like finding a secret that the game had been holding, where the act of figuring out how to evolve a specific Pokemon became its own small puzzle worth solving. The evolution conditions added depth to the world by suggesting that its creatures had complex and varied relationships to the conditions of their existence, that they were not all subject to the same simple rule of grow strong enough and change. The friendship system, introduced in Pokemon Yellow and expanded in subsequent generations, added another dimension to the relationship between player and creature. Certain Pokemon would only evolve when their friendship with the player had reached a sufficient level, requiring not just the accumulation of experience through battle, but the accumulation of something more like trust, built through carrying the Pokemon in the party, using items to care for it, avoiding letting it faint. The friendship system made the bond between player and Pokemon a mechanical reality as well as an emotional one, gave it a number that could be tracked and developed and eventually translated into a form change. This was another design decision that prioritized feeling over efficiency, that said the game would reward players who cared about their Pokemon in ways that went beyond battle optimization. A player who kept the same Pokemon in their party throughout the whole game and took care of it and never let it faint would eventually unlock something that a player who ignored those considerations would not. The game created mechanical incentives for the kind of engagement that already felt natural and rewarding, gave a structural acknowledgement to something that players were already doing. The hidden machines, the items known as HMs, that take Pokemon moves usable in the field, as well as in battle, were another design element with a specific history. Cut, which allowed Pokemon to remove small trees blocking paths. Surf, which allowed Pokemon to carry the player across bodies of water. Fly, which allowed fast travel between previously visited locations. Strength, which allowed Pokemon to push boulders. These were not just battle moves, they were keys to the world, tools for navigating a geography that had been designed around their existence. The HM system was designed to create a world where access depended on the Pokemon you carried, where the makeup of your team had practical consequences that extended beyond battle. A player without a Pokemon that could learn Surf could not cross the water routes that divided the Kanto region. A player without Cut could not clear the small trees that blocked certain paths. The requirement to have these moves accessible meant that every team carried at least one Pokemon whose primary purpose was not battle but navigation, a creature whose value to the player was measured in geographic access rather than combat capability. The HM system has since been criticized and revised in subsequent generations, and eventually removed entirely in favor of other navigation mechanics that did not require dedicating party slots to field moves. But in the original games, the system created a genuine and interesting design problem for players building their teams. The need to balance battle capability against field utility, to find Pokemon that could serve both purposes, or to accept that some party members would be dedicated to navigation rather than combat, was a resource management challenge that gave the party composition decisions additional texture. The specific HMs chosen for the original games reflect the geography of Kanto, the routes and caves and water bodies that define the region's layout. The world was designed in dialogue with the HMs, the geography shaped by what moves existed, and the moves shaped by what the geography needed. Surf exists because the original game designers wanted large water routes to be part of the world, and wanted those routes to feel like they required something from the player, required the acquisition of a specific capability before the crossing could be made. The water routes and the Surf HM were designed together, each making sense only in relation to the other. This kind of integrated design, where the world and the mechanics were developed in dialogue with each other, where each shaped and responded to the other, is one of the qualities that makes the original Kanto region feel coherent rather than arbitrary. The geography does not feel like a collection of random obstacles. It feels like a world that has its own logic, where the barriers between areas exist for reasons that are legible even if they are not explicitly explained. The small trees require cut, not because the game needed a reason to include the cut HM, but because small trees would naturally block paths in the kind of environment Kanto represents, and a Pokemon that can cut through vegetation would naturally be the solution. This naturalness of fit between the world's design and the mechanics that navigate it was not accidental. It was the result of thinking about both at the same time, of designing the world as a coherent place rather than designing the mechanics and then building a world to accommodate them, or designing the world and then inventing mechanics to fit it. The dialogue between the two produced something that felt like it belonged together, like it had always been this way. The item system in the original games, the collection of objects that could be found, purchased, or received through trades and events, was designed to create a sense of a world that contained more than combat, a world where things existed for purposes beyond the immediate utility of winning battles. Potions and antidotes and status healing items served practical purposes, restoring health and removing conditions that battles could impose. But the item system also included things like the bicycle, the fishing rods, the Pokeflute, the item finder, items that served purposes other than combat, that were part of how the player moved through and interacted with the world. The item finder, which could be used to detect hidden items buried in the ground or placed invisibly in specific squares of the game's map, represented a design philosophy of rewarding exploration and attention. Players who moved carefully through the world, who checked areas that seemed like they might contain something, who used the item finder regularly, would find things that players who moved quickly toward objectives would miss. The hidden items were not necessary for completing the game. They were bonuses for the attentive, acknowledgments that the world had more in it than any single pass-through would reveal. This philosophy of rewarding attentive play extended through many aspects of the original games. The dialogue of incidental NPCs who mentioned things that would only become relevant much later in the journey. The seemingly impassable areas that could only be navigated with HMs not yet acquired, marked in memory for return rather than ignored. The specific locations where rare Pokemon could be found, discovered through experimentation or shared knowledge rather than through any in-game guidance. All of these invited a kind of play that was more like inhabiting a world than moving through a challenge, more like exploration than completion. The TMs, or technical machines, that taught specific moves to compatible Pokemon were another element of the item system that created meaningful choices. Unlike HMs, which could be taught repeatedly to as many Pokemon as were compatible, TMs in the original games were single use. Once used, the TM was gone. This made the decision of which Pokemon to teach a given TM genuinely consequential, genuinely irreversible in a way that the game did not allow the player to undo. A TM used on a Pokemon that would later be released or boxed was gone, its move no longer available to any other Pokemon on the team. This single use quality of TMs created another design space of meaningful decision making, another place where the game asked the player to commit to a choice with long term consequences. Players who used a TM quickly on the first compatible Pokemon they encountered might later wish they had saved it for a creature that would have used the move more effectively. Players who hoarded TMs, reluctant to commit, might arrive at the Pokemon League with a party less capable than it could have been, denied capabilities they had been carrying but not using. The TM system punished both recklessness and excessive caution, asked for a calibrated judgment about the right moment to commit. The eventual change of TMs to unlimited use in later generations was a quality of life improvement that removed a source of regret and frustration, made the system more accessible and less punishing. But the original single use design created a relationship to items that was genuinely tense, that made the inventory feel like a collection of commitments not yet made rather than simply a stockpile of resources. Every TM in the bag was a decision waiting to happen, carrying the weight of the choice that had not yet been made about where its content would eventually land. The Pokemon storage system, the collection of boxes accessible at Pokemon centers where players could deposit Pokemon they were not currently carrying, was a design element that addressed a real constraint of the original game's structure. The player could carry only 6 Pokemon at any given time, but there were far more than 6 creatures in the world worth catching. The storage system allowed players to build a collection beyond the 6 Pokemon limit, to keep creatures they were not actively using without releasing them permanently. In the original games, the storage system required access to a Pokemon Center and had a specific structure of named boxes each with limited capacity. The interface was functional rather than elegant, a system for storing and retrieving creatures without much consideration for how the player might organize or engage with their collection beyond the immediate need to move Pokemon in and out of the active party. Later generations would expand and improve the system significantly, adding search functions and organization tools and ways of engaging with the stored collection that made it feel like more than a filing cabinet for creatures not currently in use. But the original storage system established the fundamental premise that the Pokemon a player was not currently carrying still existed somewhere, were not simply absent until summoned, were stored in a specific place with a specific technology that the world of the game treated as real. Bill, the Pokemon storage system's creator, who the player encountered in a memorable early quest, was a character specifically designed to ground the storage system in the fiction of the game, to give it a human origin and a sense that it was an invention within the world rather than simply a game mechanic without in-world explanation. The narrative detail of Bill, a researcher who had accidentally merged himself with a Pokemon while working on teleportation technology and required the player's help to restore himself to human form, was one of the original game's more memorable incidental encounters. A small story embedded in the larger journey that gave the storage system a creator and the world a sense of having an interior life beyond the main quest's concerns. Players who helped Bill were rewarded with access to the storage system and with a sense of having participated in something that the game's world treated as genuinely meaningful. This practice of giving mechanical systems in-world explanations, of creating characters and narrative contexts for the things players used, was part of how the original games constructed a sense of a coherent world rather than simply a game environment. The Pokédex was given to the player by Professor Oak, who had a reason for wanting it completed. The Pokémon storage system was created by Bill, who had a personal stake in its development. The moves the Pokémon learned through TMs had been developed by researchers who believed in their utility. Each system existed within a fiction that treated the game's mechanics as real things in a real world, built by real people for real purposes. This quality of treating the game's systems as if they were natural features of a coherent world rather than transparent mechanics is one of the things that made the original games feel immersive to players who were young enough to engage with them imaginatively rather than analytically. The systems did not break the fiction by announcing themselves as systems. They existed within the fiction, given explanations and contexts that made them feel like parts of a world where things had reasons for being the way they were. The regional professor tradition, established through Professor Oak and continued through every subsequent generation, carries within it a quiet design decision that became an organizing principle of the franchise. The professors are the player's connection to the academic world of Pokemon research, the figures who explain the Pokedex's purpose and give the journey its stated academic rationale. Completing the Pokedex is, in the fiction of the games, a research project, a contribution to the professor's work of documenting all the Pokemon in the world. The player is, nominally, a research assistant as much as an adventure seeker. This framing gives the completionist impulse that Pokemon games are famous for encouraging a narrative justification. Catching them all is not simply a collection game. It is the completion of a research task that someone in the world has a reason to want done. The professor's enthusiasm for the completed Pokédex, expressed in the brief interaction when all entries are filled, is the game's acknowledgement of the research framing. Its recognition that the player has done something that the world of the game treats as genuinely significant. The specific design of Oak as a character, elderly but energetic, forgetful in small ways that the game uses for gentle humor, passionate about Pokemon in a way that communicates itself immediately, was the template from which all subsequent professors were drawn. Elm, the professor of Johto, was designed as a younger and more nervous counterpart, reflecting the different tone of the second generation's region. Birch, the professor of Hoenn, was designed as an outdoorsy and physically active researcher, someone who studied Pokemon in the field rather than in a laboratory. Each subsequent professor was designed to reflect the character of their region and the aesthetic priorities of their generation. The naming convention that assigned tree names to professors, Oak and Elm and Birch and Rowan, and the others that followed, was established through Oak and then honored by the teams that designed subsequent professors without any official announcement or statement of policy. It is the kind of creative continuity that emerges from a design culture that values coherence and tradition, that looks to what came before and finds in it something worth continuing. The rival's unnamed status in the original games is another design detail with specific intentions behind it. The game asks you to name your rival at the beginning, just as it asks you to name the player character. This parallelism makes the rival feel like an extension of the player's own experience, like two players choosing their starting points in the same moment, beginning the same journey in different directions. The name the player gives the rival becomes the name the game uses for that character throughout the experience, which means the rival is partially a creation of the player, partially imagined by whoever is playing. This mechanic of naming the rival contributed to the sense that the relationship between player and rival was personal rather than generic, that this particular character had this particular name because the player had given it to them, that the competition between them was specific and individual rather than a template applied to every playthrough. Players who gave their rival a name they found funny or menacing or nostalgic were creating a slightly different experience than players who left the default or chose something else. The rival was, in this small way, customized by the player, made partly their own creation. The concept of version exclusivity, the design decision that made certain Pokemon available only in red and others only in blue, was the mechanic most directly responsible for making the trading system necessary rather than optional. If every Pokemon had been available in both versions, there would be no mechanical reason to find another player and trade. The world might still have been designed to encourage trading as an activity, but there would be no structural requirement for it. The exclusivity made the social mechanic of trading functionally necessary for anyone attempting to complete the Pokédex. This was an elegant design solution to the problem of encouraging a social mechanic that the game could not force. The game could not make two players sitting in the same room trade with each other. It could only create conditions where trading with another player was the only way to accomplish something the game asked for. The version exclusivity created those conditions, made the social mechanic structurally necessary, and transformed what might have been an optional curiosity into a core feature of how the game was experienced by players who took its stated goals seriously. The specific Pokemon that were made exclusive to each version reflected a design logic of ensuring that neither version was clearly superior to the other, that neither red nor blue was the obvious choice for a player who wanted the better game. The version exclusive Pokemon were deliberately designed to feel comparable in desirability, to not create a situation where one version was simply the right answer. Players who preferred one set of exclusives might still reasonably prefer either version depending on their specific aesthetic preferences, and the game was designed to make that choice genuinely ambiguous. The social dynamic that version exclusivity created extended beyond the simple act of trading. It created a community of players with different versions who had different things to offer each other, who had a reason to seek each other out and engage in an exchange that benefited both parties. The playground negotiations over Pokemon trades, the careful evaluation of what one player had and what another wanted, the long-term relationships that formed between the players who regularly traded and battled, all of this was made possible by the design decision to split the roster between versions. The playground community of Pokemon players in the late 1990s represents a specific cultural moment that the game's design actively produced. The game was designed to create those communities, to ensure that playing Pokemon in isolation was a lesser experience than playing it in connection with other players, that the game's full depth could only be accessed socially. The communities that formed around the games were not simply a byproduct of the game's popularity. They were designed into the game from the beginning, made structurally necessary by the mechanics that required social interaction to fully experience. Understanding this is understanding something important about why Pokemon became a phenomenon rather than simply a successful game. The design created communities. The communities created social reinforcement for engagement with the game. The social reinforcement expanded the audience beyond what any single player's experience could have generated. The game spread person to person in the way that things spread when the people who have experienced them have a structural reason to tell others about them when the experience itself is designed to be shared. The sound design of the original games, beyond the save sound variation that Masuda embedded between versions, was built around the specific tonal qualities of the Game Boy's sound chip, a piece of hardware that produced sounds through a specific kind of synthesis that gave the audio of that era a distinctive character. The beeps and tones and rhythmic progressions that make up the Pokemon music are not simply simplified versions of what the music might have been on more capable hardware. They are the product of a specific tool used by a specific person who understood its qualities and worked within them to produce something that felt right for the experience being created. Masuda has spoken about the process of composing for the Game Boy's sound chip as one of genuine creative engagement, not as a compromise with limitation, but as work done within a specific medium with its own qualities and possibilities. The constraint of the hardware shaped the music in ways that, in retrospect, were not simply limiting, but generative. Music made for the Game Boy's sound chip has a quality that music made for more capable hardware does not have, a quality of purity and directness that comes from not having the option of complexity, from having to communicate through simple tones arranged with care. The Pokemon Center theme, the piece of music that plays in every Pokemon Center in the original games, is one of the most effective pieces of functional game music ever composed. A piece that communicates rest and safety and recovery in fewer notes than most composers would consider sufficient for any of those effects. Players who had been through difficult stretches of cave exploration or challenging trainer battles arrived at the Pokemon Center and heard that music and felt something change in their body, a release of tension that the music both acknowledged and encouraged. The music knew what the player had been through and told them they were safe now. This functional quality of the Pokemon Center music, its ability to serve the specific emotional need of the moment it was designed to accompany, is a quality that Masuda developed through careful attention to the relationship between music and gameplay context. Each piece of music in the original games was designed to serve the emotional and functional needs of the space or situation it accompanied. The music was not simply pleasant background sound. It was an active participant in the experience, shaping how the player felt about where they were and what they were doing. The battle music carried urgency without inducing panic, kept the player engaged in the challenge without making the challenge feel overwhelming. The route music communicated the specific atmosphere of each outdoor area, distinguishing the route that wound through a city's outskirts from the route that cut through a forest or ran along a shoreline. The cave music created a specific kind of tension that made the darkness of those environments feel real without making the game feel hostile. Each of these musical qualities was calibrated to serve a specific experiential purpose, and the calibration was successful enough that the music has remained associated with those experiences through decades of replaying. The cry system, through which each Pokemon in the original games was given a distinctive sound to play when it appeared in battle, was another element of the audio design that required creative work within significant constraints. Each cry had to be distinctive enough to be recognizable as belonging to a specific Pokemon, had to communicate something about the creature's character or size or energy, had to be producible within the limits of the hardware's sound capabilities. Some cries were simple and direct, others were more complex, using the synthesis characteristics of the hardware to create sounds that felt genuinely alien or powerful or gentle depending on the creature they represented. The move animations in the original games, the visual effects that accompanied each attack in battle, were another element of the design that worked within the constraints of the hardware to create something that communicated effectively without being able to be visually complex. The flashing of the screen to indicate a hit, the specific patterns of movement that represented different types of attacks, the way the opponent's sprite shook when it took damage. All of these were the visual vocabulary of battle in the original games, conventions established in those first entries that have been honored and elaborated in every subsequent generation. The sprite animations for the Pokemon themselves in the original games were limited to a single static image for each creature, displayed on screen without movement or animation, except for the sprite's repositioning to indicate certain effects. Later games would add animated sprites, would give each Pokemon a distinctive idle animation that communicated personality and energy. The original games had only the static image, but that image was drawn with enough care and character that players formed genuine impressions of personality from it. A Snorlax sprite that conveyed bulk and sleepiness through its proportions and posture. A Gengar sprite that communicated mischief through its expression. A Gyarados sprite that made the creature feel powerful and slightly threatening even in a small image on a small screen. The quality of the original sprites was the product of Sugimori's design skills and the work of the artists who translated those designs into pixel form. The translation from a drawing to a sprite was not automatic or trivial. It required understanding which details of the drawing were essential to the character and which could be simplified or removed without losing the creature's identity, required making those simplification decisions at very small scales where the margin for error was essentially non existent. A few pixels in the wrong place could make a sprite look wrong in ways that were easy to perceive but difficult to articulate, and the process of getting the sprites right required iteration and adjustment at the scale of individual pixels. The constraint of creating sprites at that scale for 151 creatures was an enormous amount of work, and the consistency of quality across that many sprites reflects a discipline and attention to detail that the games would not have achieved without it. The sprites of the original games are not impressive by the standards of what hardware can do today, but they were exactly right for what the hardware of that era could produce, exactly calibrated to the constraints they operated within, and they communicated what they needed to communicate with an efficiency that more complex visuals might not have matched. The map design of Kanto, the layout of the region's cities and routes and dungeons and water bodies was another product of the development process that reflected specific intentions about how the world should feel to move through. Kanto was designed as a loop, a region where the player could travel continuously in one direction and eventually return to where they started, a world without a dead end that would require backtracking. The roads and sea routes and cave systems connect in ways that allow circular navigation that make the region feel like a place that can be explored from multiple directions rather than a linear sequence of areas that must be visited in order. This circular geography created a specific quality of openness, a sense that the world could be approached from different angles and that revisiting familiar areas might reveal new things, now that the player had capabilities they had not had on the first pass. The late game return to areas like the Pokémon Mansion or the Seafoam Islands, now accessible in their fuller depth, was enabled by the circular geography that made returning to early areas feel natural rather than like moving backward against the grain of the design. Another thread of development history worth following is the history of the game's localization for international audiences, the process by which the Japanese original was adapted for players in North America, Europe, and other markets. The localization process involved far more than translation. It involved reconsidering design elements that worked in one cultural context and might not work in another, making decisions about what to change and what to preserve, navigating the differences between markets that had different expectations and different sensibilities. The name changes that accompanied localization are among the most visible products of this process. Many Pokémon names were changed between the Japanese release and the international release, adapted to work in different languages, to fit pronunciation conventions, to avoid unintended meanings, to better reflect the creature's character or inspiration. Some of the new names were straightforward translations or transliterations of the Japanese originals. Others were entirely new coinages that kept the spirit of the original name while creating something that worked better in English or other target languages. The naming process for Pokémon localization was its own creative endeavor, requiring people who were fluent both in the target language and in the design philosophy of the games to generate names that felt right in a new linguistic context while remaining true to the creature's identity. A name that was a pun in Japanese required an equivalent pun in English that worked without being explained. A name that referenced a specific Japanese cultural concept required either a translation of that concept or a replacement with an equivalent concept from the target culture's references. The localization team did this for 151 Pokémon simultaneously, and the results have been so thoroughly absorbed into how players know the creatures that it is now difficult to think of them by their Japanese names, even for players who know those names. The process of adapting the games for different markets also involved adjustments to content that might be received differently in different cultural contexts. Certain Pokémon designs were modified slightly, certain in-game images were changed. The ghost-type Pokémon encountered in the Pokémon Tower which appeared as formless shapes until the Sylph scope revealed them as specific creatures, were adjusted in ways that varied between regional releases, reflecting different cultural sensitivities about how ghostly imagery should be presented. These localization decisions were made by people who understood that the game was being received by audiences with different cultural backgrounds and different expectations, who were trying to ensure that the experience translated effectively across those differences without losing what made it worth translating. The localization of Pokémon was ultimately successful enough that the games created the same kinds of communities and attachments and long term relationships in international markets that they had created in Japan, which suggests that the adaptation was done with enough skill to preserve the core experience, even across significant cultural distance. The specific names that became iconic in each market reflect the work of the localization teams and their particular creative contributions. The English names for the original Pokemon were generated through a specific creative process, with specific people making specific decisions, and those names have been carried by players for decades as if they were the only possible names for those creatures: Squirtle, Bulbasaur, Gengar, Snorlax. These are not translations. They are new words, invented in the process of localization, now as much a part of what those creatures are as their designs. The passage of time from the original games to the present day carries within it a specific kind of quiet knowledge, the awareness that what felt immediate and new when encountered in childhood is now decades old, that the world those games were made in has changed in ways that would be unrecognizable to the people who made them. The Game Boy is now a historical artifact. The link cable is a technology that no longer connects to anything current. The battery that sustained the save file has, in most original cartridges, long since exhausted itself. And yet the games persist. Not the physical cartridges in most cases, but the experience, the feeling, the specific quality of the relationship between a player and the world those games contained. That relationship can be accessed through emulation, through the remakes and reimaginings that Nintendo has released periodically, through the later entries in the franchise that carry forward the essential structure while updating the hardware and the visual design. The feeling of the original games is available through many different doors, even if the original door has long since closed. The people who made those original games are still making Pokemon games. Game Freak remains the development studio responsible for the main series, and members of the original team who were there in the early years are still involved in various capacities with the ongoing franchise. Masuda has continued to compose and produce. Sugimori has continued to design. The studio itself has grown significantly from the small team that completed Red and Green, but there is a thread of continuity connecting the people who made the first game to the people making the latest one. That continuity is unusual. Most creative projects of the scale that Pokemon has become are not sustained by the people who started them across the full arc of their development. The creative team's turnover. The original vision gets diluted or transformed by the people who inherit it. What Game Freak has maintained across 30 years is a consistency of creative vision that, while it has evolved and changed and sometimes frustrated fans who wanted something different, has remained recognizably itself, recognizably connected to the values and instincts that shaped the first games. The small decisions that were made in the development of those first games, the ones that have been explored across this quiet evening, are still present in the games being made today. The nicknaming system, the starter selection, the legendary Pokemon hidden in specific locations, the experience of moving through a world and finding what it contains. These are still the architecture of the experience. The specific content has changed dramatically. The architecture has remained stable. That stability is the most remarkable development secret of all, more remarkable than any specific design choice or revised feature or cut content. The secret is that the people who built this thing understood something essential about what it was supposed to be, and protected that essential quality through 3 decades of change. They understood that the games were about the relationship between a person and the creatures they carried, and they made every decision in service of that relationship, including the decisions about nicknaming and save files and type design and the small sad sound of a game saving your single precious file. The world around the Pokemon games has changed in ways that make certain aspects of their design feel like artifacts of a different era. The link cable, that was the social nervous system of the original games, has been replaced by wireless communication and online play, by the global trade system that allows trading with players on the other side of the world rather than the other side of a schoolyard. The playground negotiations over Pokemon trades have been replaced by online communities and auction systems and breeding programs of extraordinary complexity. The simplicity of the original social mechanic, two kids with a cable and a desire to complete their Pokedexes, has given way to something vast and global and continuously available. And yet, the fundamental impulse that the original social mechanic was designed to satisfy, the desire to find what another player has and offer what you have in return, is still present in all of those more complex modern systems. The global trade system is still an expression of the same design philosophy that made Pokemon version exclusive in the first generation. The online community that coordinates breeding and trading is still enacting the same basic dynamic that the link cable created between two players in the same room. The scale has changed by orders of magnitude. The impulse has not changed at all. There is something worth resting with in this observation, something worth considering slowly. The things that made the original games work were not specific to the technology of the original games. They were specific to something about human beings, about how people engage with games and with each other through games, about what makes a system of exchange feel meaningful and what makes a competitive encounter feel satisfying and what makes a creature feel like yours. Those qualities travel. They survived the transition from Game Boy to every subsequent platform. They survived from the link cable to wireless to online. They survived from the grayscale screen of the original hardware to the high-definition displays of the current generation. They will likely survive into whatever comes next, because they are built on something more durable than any particular technology. They are built on the specific qualities of how human beings respond to care and competition and collection and the simple pleasure of naming something and watching it grow. These are the real development secrets of the Pokemon games, not the specific decisions, though those are interesting and worth knowing, but the understanding that informed those decisions, the recognition that the games were ultimately about relationships, and that every mechanical choice should serve the quality of those relationships first and everything else second. The people who made the original games had that understanding, worked from it, protected it through the years of development and the pressures of the medium and the constraints of the hardware. And the result has been carried by the people who played those games through the decades since, has become part of how they understand themselves and what they value and what they return to when they want to feel something specific that is hard to find elsewhere. That is the most important thing the development history reveals, not what was cut or changed or added, but what was protected through everything, because the people making the decisions understood that it was the thing worth protecting. The games rest now in their cases and their digital archives, carrying everything they have always carried, patient as they have always been, waiting for the next person who comes to them with the right kind of attention and finds in them exactly what they came looking for. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.